And so we return and begin again. Welcome to the Invisible Podcast, Issuesode 12. We are going issue by issue, page by page, panel by panel, theory by theory, island by island through Grant Morrison's Cosmic Conspiracy classic, The Invisibles. And we are up to issue 12, Best Man Full. On the sturdiness test, it's doing really well. It's a strong issue in more ways than one. Let's start with the cover. Let's get right into it. Let's start with the cover. A reasonable amount going on here. If we have a metric for how much going on this per page, this one's not great, not bad. We've got your mod to target, your RAF roundel here, forming a target that centres on the head of a guy who I guess we can assume is Bobby Murray, who's our protagonist for the issue. The best bit about it, it's a very nice kind of designed-y, realistic portrayal from Sean Phillips on the cover work this month. The best bit about it, in my view, is that look in his eyes. It's like a Don McCullin photograph of a wounded Vietnam soldier. Obviously, he's not. He's a wounded kind of Falklands veteran instead. But the Phillips gets something really nice in the look here. This RAF mod roundel that you can see targeting him, we will see more of in issues to come. It's a funny one, isn't it? I don't know why. I do know why it made a comeback at this time. This was a big '90s thing. It was part of the kind of the basic like '60s beat pop revival that Britpop basically was and was kind of current at this time. A lot of the iconography of that period was kind of revived. And the RAF roundel, or the mod target, is what I normally call it. Dates from the Second World War, obviously. There's an element of sympathetic repulsion here. Maybe this is like polarity magic or something. But in order to tell the planes apart in the air, so that your own guys wouldn't shoot at you, they painted targets on them. And this one originally was used by like the French Air Force, and then the British Air Force went, no, we'll have it because the colours are cool. And the French, you can have another one, and that was like okay. But that was that happened. And then this kind of roundel, a roundel is basically these kind of concentric circles of colour. These date back to like old medieval heraldry. These are aesthetic items which have an ever-shifting historic kind of set of historic layers working their way in and out of the concentric rings. But what it means... see, this is the thing. I don't know what it means. I don't know why, other than the fact that it is like a target, that it gives you, it gives you something to shoot at, even though the whole point of putting it on the plane was that you wouldn't shoot at it. Apart from having that kind of like focusing aspect, that kind of concentrating feel, those concentric circles, I don't know what they mean, and yet I sort of do know what they mean. At this time, and they'd been kind of like, okay, so like the journey of the RAF roundel kind of comes through the kind of the American pop art of like Jasper Johns, who like did loads of paintings of them in the early 60s, incorporating huge like roundels or many small roundels into his impressive like layered textured canvases. Like they look like these kind of big bold pop art simple abstract shapes until you get closer, and then you realise that they're a bit like this. In fact, if you get closer to this, you realise there's some fairly indistinct. I think it's like stones on a beach, like pebbles on a beach. I think it's like stones on a beach. It's like a photo that's been sort of statted into the background of the rings of the target. I think that it means this. It's this weird kind of anti-English, pro-Englishness, basically. So so Johns would have all of these very textured layers building up into his canvases, which from a distance looked simple, and that's maybe what this is about. This is about a kind of not a celebrate. Yeah, it's about a kind of what's the word we'd have now? Like a reappropriation, I guess, of old school militaristic, wartime iconography that, partly out of nostalgia and partly out of a rejection of that nostalgia, the youth movements of the 1960s decided to reappropriate and wear as like a mark of, as like an ironic mark of rebellion against that, you know, kind of that kind of like stuffy old school war era vibe. Yeah, that kind of symbolism. Like, so you'd wear a military symbol ironically to show how anti-militaristic you were. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, you know, it sounds dumb actually when you say it out loud, but I think that's kind of it. So like bands, specifically the Who, who were like a mod band, and like, you know, they were in mod, like this kind of like early beat pop, heavy R&B influence that like white English kids were taking on and turning into something a bit, you know, guitar pop, a bit different to you know, a bit, you know, a different kind of take on blues for like working class white kids in England. It's quite, you know, it's not that anti-militaristic musically. There's these kind of like staccato rhythms which do, you know, recall the sound of gunfire, if you like. And there's a kind of there's an aggression to the music. There's these sharp slashing kind of guitar chords. So the kind of the reappropriation by bands, specifically like the Who, the Kinks to a less degree, Small Faces a bit, their kind of adoption of this military regalia in their very sort of clean line, very modern, very like, it wasn't like a peacenik thing. It was like an ironic aggression, which, as you know, in the way that irony does, it quickly kind of drifts away and it just becomes aggression. So this kind of, so they appropriated this RAF symbol, and it's weird, right? Because the RAF is owned by the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, and it was a symbol adopted by the MODs, the mods. And I don't fit in it, and I can't get that out of my head. I can't shake the fact that it might be as simple as that. That the reason the mods took on a military target was because the military is the, you know, on a subconscious level. But there is something a bit kind of like, mod culture has got pretty Brexit. I'm gonna say it, and I literally mean the surviving members of the Who are well Brexit. So that kind of rejection of this old-fashioned kind of, yeah, like imperialistic sort of conception of what Englishness was intrinsic to, or was intrinsic to Englishness, kind of went through this ironizing period, and then the ironizing left, and it just was left with this weird sort of English exceptionalism thing. For a Scottish guy, Grant Morrison's always had a really good handle on these really odd currents of English culture. Britpop was basically an English phenomenon, and in the 90s, in homage to the Who, basically, the roundel as a fashion item came back again. And although it has gone away today, insofar as you won't see somebody wearing like a white T-shirt with one of these. Like, I haven't seen somebody wearing just a mod T-shirt for ages. And you know, and I live in Mod Central. I live in Brighton, and and mods flood the town still, much less violently than before. And they're really old, obviously. Still flood the town every bank holiday in the summer. And you still won't, and they'll still dress up like mods and stuff and do their little shimmies and have their scooters, but they don't, like, you won't see a T-shirt with just a roundel on it. However, in little pin badges or cufflinks, it's very much like the symbol of that mod culture in its 60s form and its revivals, which Morrison has this real kind of like connection to, and kind of like a good way of sort of playing with. And it was a thing in the 90s, and here it is. And that's the cover. And then we've got a soldier. He's looking wounded. He's got trauma in his eyes. And again, that's a 60s thing. There's a retro vibe here. There's a retro vibe here. And I don't mean retro as in just like repurposing some historic aesthetics. I mean there's an element of like excavation. There's like drilling into the past to see what it was and what it was doing, and that's kind of like what the issue is about. And actually, I think the drilling thing and the circles actually that works quite well, doesn't it? Maybe that's a brilliant metaphor that I just came up with. Maybe I'm a genius. And that's the cover by Sean Phillips, 95, and it's oh yeah, I was going to lead into the issue, but I can't, can I? Because the inside front cover, as always, is this nice full-page black and white advert for another comic that Vertigo are putting out. This is for issue 1 of Enigma. I thought it was The Enigma. No, okay, I think The Enigma is like the character in it, but the comic's just called Enigma. By Duncan Fegredo and Peter Milligan. Milligan was kind of talking about it a bit in our last issue in his little editorial section. The advert depicts a dude here, can't remember his name, but like the hero of, not the hero, but like the protagonist of Enigma, covered in invisible lizards and about to put on a mask. Simple, obvious, elusive, goes the tagline. Give in to your desires. A tale of sexual obsessions, flying lizards, and, believe it or not, superheroes. I haven't read the Enigma, for 20 years, probably. Maybe I said this last time, in fact, I would say that it's probably one of the best comics of this early Vertigo period. Haven't read it for a long time, might be wrong, but I think there's, like, Milligan's got a really unique voice, and and this was kind of before he obviously started phoning in superhero comics. He had a real thing here. I would say maybe some of the kind of the sexual politics feels a bit just outdated now, just like the discourse has become more sophisticated. But I remember this as being an intensely smart, wise, funny, clever, like singular, like voicey patchwork style of storytelling and presenting interesting ideas about gender and identity fluidity in a way which I'm going to bet still feels very sort of surprising and sophisticated. I think Enigma is probably still really good. What we're going to take for it though for this issue is that our young man here, our kind of hero, is putting on a mask which is blank. So it's not a blank badge, it's a blank mask. And he is surrounded by lizards, or should we say reptilians, reptoids. His body is covered with them, and yet he can't see them. So what we've got, lizards meaning like evil archonic influences about his person and clinging to him, even though he isn't really aware that they're there. So there's maybe a bit of a connect to what we're doing in this issue. Speaking of which, let's get on to page 1. But before we do that, actually, before we get onto page 1, we're going to skip ahead to Morrison's little apologia in the Invisible Ink letters column. I'm just going to read most of it, I think. Best Man Full, for those of you unfamiliar with the game, is played by children in Scotland and possibly elsewhere. The rules are savage and simple. One person takes the part of a soldier, and the other players represent his opponents. The soldier is allowed to choose the imaginary weapons used against him. He then runs wildly at his opponent and is cut down mercilessly by gunfire or shrapnel or whatever. The object of the game is to die in as spectacular, theatrical, or brutally realistic a manner as possible. It's a fun game. It's basically that, right? It's basically the getting like. It's basically that game. When the original soldier's been killed, one of his opponents takes over while the soldier gets to join the team of killers, and the process repeats itself. When everybody has had the opportunity to be killed by his peers, the winner is judged on the basis of his performance. The winner is the player who died most convincingly. Herein lies wisdom. So that's, without that little bit of preamble, it might be really hard to kind of get what's going on in this issue. And he gives it at the end because he does want you to experience it raw in all of its broken storytelling glory, in all of its non-linear magic. And that's what's happening on our front page. So basically this entire thing, spoilers, you've read it, it doesn't matter, it's not spoilers, but spoilers. all of this is like Bobby Murray in the Bardo. It's this guy who we follow through life, who is sort of flashing back, but not flashing back, kind of flashing around with memories of his life as he lies dying, and he's basically, and it's basically like we go from this innocent young lad playing at, engaging in a sort of in a pantomime, in a simulation of violence. He drifts through life in a series of unsimulated violences that sculpt him into a less than entirely tickety-boo person, and then there's like there's like a sting in the tail, right? Or we kind of, there's a reveal, which we'll get to when we get to the reveal, although you know what it is. But that's where we are, and this issue jumps around his kind of dying memories, his voice at different points in his life, his perspective, the things that happen to him. We see them all in a very sort of chippy-choppy fashion. I'm not going to sort of lead you through the chips and the chops in the narrative because I'll get them wrong. You'll work them out for yourself, and it's boring. It's not why I'm here to tell you how to read the comic. But there is quite a lot going on here. We'll say straight away that this first page, as you can see, is drawn by the incomparable Steve Parkhouse. This is the third issue in the run of 3 one-off issues with individual guest artists per issue that we've had now. This is like the final one of the chunk, and we've had Chris Weston doing the first one, the Voodoo one. We had John Ridgway doing the second one, the middle one, the haunted house folk horror creepy M.R. James one. And as much as I really love the artwork in both of those two for different reasons, and as much as I think that the Ridgway one is my favourite one, you got to give the art, like Parkhouse's art in this is next level. He's so good. He has this incredible way of like synthesizing like the British boys comics of your youth, probably not your youth, but my youth, and filling them with like a kind of with a modern sort of, kind of like American appropriate or kind of like genre appropriate. I don't know what it is, but basically he draws just these faces which look like faces out of the Beano, but they look like faces out of real life at the same time. He draws these wonderful towns and this kind of just this patch of wasteland here looks like something out of a comic, but it looks like something out of the real world that is a comic as well, right? There's just something so great about it. Note here we have the fool on the hill, if you like, the way that the dog here is accompanying him in this kind of foolish descent into danger down the hill. That's relevant, guys. That's the tarot. That's the tarot. But Parkhouse's art is absolutely off the chain on this, and we'll go when we go through it. I'll pick out some of my favourite panels and stuff. But I think Steve Parkhouse is much under kind of propped as somebody who's just an amazing like comic book artist, and you don't see him as often as you should do. He, if I finish talking about Steve Parkhouse for now, he's just really great. Is all you need to know. So okay, so we're sort of starting. We've got a few flashbacks, but then we're back in Bobby Murray's past. He's playing Dead Man Fall, which is the title of the issue. He chooses to die by rifle. Go and and he starts to get shot by his buddies. Dog and him are having a great time. Boom, smash cut. We're in the Falklands, and he's getting blown up by an Argentinian shell, I guess. So those smash cuts and those jumping between timelines, they happen a lot. It's basically him as a child and growing older into young adulthood, him today, which is obviously like 1995, and him in the Falklands. Those are like the three, although one of them is more kind of mobile than the other one. His kind of his youth is obviously moving through time. We also get these the two main fixed points of the Falklands and his present day existence, or very close to it, very near behind his present day existence. But we've got this splash page. It's a big ass boom as this the childhood game suddenly becomes very all too horribly real. And we've got our credits. Let's go to it. We've got Grant Morrison, writer Steve Parkhouse, artist Annie Parkhouse, letterer. I don't know what that means. I think maybe Annie Parkhouse did these letters here. Maybe she did some of this lettering here. But she's down as letterer. Daniel Votso does the colours, but Clem Robbins is down as letters. So I'm not entirely sure what the division of labour, typographically was. But Annie Parkhouse, who I presume is a relation of Steve Parkhouse, was involved. So she's new to the team as well as Steve is. Welcome, guys. Julie Rottenberg, associate editor. Stuart Moore, editor. The Invisibles, created by Grant Morrison. Best man, Fall. Actually, before we go on to the Falklands section, before we go Falklands, this is a really interestingly told issue with all of the time cuts, as I just said. But it's all just presented very sort of blankly, and we're left to stitch it all together ourselves. There's no sort of connective tissue, if you like, kind of helping the comic book narrative along, except for this caption here in our first panel, try to remember, and then this one here, it's only a game. These are reversed when we get to the final two panels of the comic as well. But there's this kind of, I think this is maybe the first time that it kind of pops up in the Invisibles. I mean, arguably it's been there underneath all along. But the theme is like anamnesis, right? The theme is unforgetting, returning to a state of kind of better knowledge, which maybe in some sense is less knowledge or innocence, if you like. In fact, it obviously connects back to some of the Blakey stuff, the William Blake stuff that we were talking about in the issues like 2 to 5, 2 to 4. Yeah, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, you know what I mean. The Dane, McGowan, and Mad Tom stuff, and the William Blake strand that runs through that. That return to like grace, to an innocence, which is obviously where we start here with Bobby's childhood. That's like a kind of a theme in the Invisibles, but it's a theme in like Gnostic theology altogether, right? A kind of a stripping away of certain human illusions to reveal a purity, yeah, a kind of a grace, like a more authentic, a more clean and pure and good way of seeing and being in the world, and a better, cleaner, purer, etc. world for us to be in. That's all going on here too. Speaking of pure worlds, boom, the Falklands. Now, I'm recording this in the middle of November 2019. You can go, we know by now that the Invisibles does this. If you're doing a bit of a thing for the Invisibles, expect something else connected to that to jump out of a completely unexpected, unforeseen angle and smack you right upside the head, basically. So, Falklands, right? I'm recording this about 2 days ago. Prince Andrew, who's the Queen of England's middle son. Prince Andrew he's the one who's been hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, and he shouldn't have been. He really freaking shouldn't have been, should he? He's just been on telly giving the kind of like car crash, monarchy shaking interview like we haven't seen since the days of Princess Diana, who we talked about a lot in our previous episode, right? Prince Andrew did a Diana. I wonder whether Diana be done to him. Probably not. He is a bit closer to being in the family. But he's creating a huge embarrassment for in the royal family. And not just in the royal family, but within the kind of the, hey, we're a bunch of paedophiles, elite networks that the royal family of the UK is embedded in and originated in many ways, like literally the world's oldest, like the most successful and nastiest criminal conspiracy. It's the English royal family. He said that it couldn't have been him who is described in this poor child who's been raped has deposition, because she describes the man as sweating, and everybody knows that Prince Andrew can't sweat because he got shot at in the Falklands. He got shot at in the Falklands, and that gave him such a jolt of adrenaline that it stopped him from being able to. He can't sweat anymore, or at least he can now. But for a long time he couldn't because he was saving our lives in the Falklands. He definitely wasn't like kept well away from the front line. He was being shot at in the Falklands. He's a fucking war hero. He's not. He isn't. He wasn't. So yeah, he's basically been just lying and bullshitting his way through this interview. But one of the bullshits that he pulls out of his arse is the Falklands, and I'm like, but hang on, I've been reading about the Falklands for my Invisibles research, like literally the past few days. Why is Prince Andrew on telly talking about the Falklands and about how it stopped him from being able to sweat? Maybe made him a bit of a one of those guys. Anyway, I'm not pointing at like the gay guy from the Enigma. I'm pointing at the lizard on his shoulder, right? Lizards can't sweat, right? We know that. But also, they're reptoids that eat babies and they control the world, okay? And Bobby Murray is in the Falklands. Now, there is a really good conspiracy theory to do with the Falklands. And I don't know whether I should tell you it now or a bit later on. Maybe you know it already. No, I'm going to tell you it now. Basically, the Black Goo, the Falklands, and the Marconi deaths. Let's get into it. Obviously, I'm not talking about the well-known, widely accepted, kind of obviously true conspiracy theories around Thatcher, either invading the Falklands in the first place in order to give her election campaign a boost, which we come to later again in the issue. Not even talking about her obvious war crime in the sinking of the Belgrano as it was retreating from a conflict area. She did that because she was the high priestess of the death cult at the end of history. She wanted to get some scores on the doors, if you like, in that regard, get some blood going. Those are both just obviously true, but there's in recent years, so since maybe I don't know the mid 2000s, I suppose. Conspiracy theory emerged from people who were, Falklands vets, whatever. Basically, outside of like the main Falkland Islands, as we understand it, the main conflict area, the main, the part of the Falklands, Malvinas, that was kind of under like direct contention during the conflict. South of all of that, there's another island which is basically one of the Falkland Islands, but kind of isn't really because it's uninhabited, as far as we know. Called Thule Island, right? Now, Thule Island, obviously, it immediately gets your conspiracy radar going, just the name of it. Thule is like a German word, which means at the end of the earth, because it is basically at the end of the earth. It's like, next stop Antarctica, basically, which is suspicious too, right? So this is kind of spinning out of the sort of like macro conspiracy theory of the breakaway civilization, or the kind of the Nazi survival, basically, which is that so kind of Nazis with high technology and excellent organizational skills and a penchant for like death worship and black magic decamped after they were defeated in the Second World War. They set up rat lines, escaped. They kind of were harboured in Spain, and then moved to like German territories and sort of safe zones in Argentina primarily, which is who the Falklands conflict was fought against between the UK against the UK, obviously, and other various bolt holes in particularly South America, but as I say, also Spain, where they kind of were harboured for a bit before being funnelled out, and also on their secret submarine bases in Antarctica, which everyone knows about. So this conspiracy theory sort of goes back to not long after the Second World War, really. So if you think of movies like The Odessa File and The Boys from Brazil, it all kind of spins out of that. Then the thread kind of went dormant sort of in the final decades of the 20th century, and then sort of warmed up again. So the Nazi connection here, aside from the one that I just said, is that like Thule Island connects via, magical thinking, sympathetic resonance with Thule Gesellschaft. Thule Gesellschaft, or the Thule Society, was basically like a think tank, kind of a Masonic club network thing in Germany in the pre and interwar years, where a lot of the like ideology and frankly like political resentments and genocidal hatred that powered the Nazi Party itself was kind of workshopped and disseminated. So the Thule Gesellschaft, the Thule Society, was like a bunch of like posh mental Germans. Kind of the mix in like post-World War I trauma turns into the Nazi Party. There are other like feeder orgs that kind of bled into the Nazi Party, which was the point where these kind of like occult, if you like, agendas went overground, went mainstream in German society. But the Thule Society was kind of where it happened. So maybe they had an island, right? I don't know when the Thule Island and south of the Falklands was christened as such, but there's basically a story that has emerged in the conspirasphere and in the past year, like I say, 10 years or so, that there was, and I think obviously some of this is verifiable, and then certain details kind of aren't. There was a mission after the ceasefire in the Falklands War, which was only about 6 weeks long. There was a kind of a side mission to Thule Island, where a bunch of like paras or British servicemen with a specialism in munitions, in like demolition and destruction, went to Thule Island with a few kind of like suspicious looking Fed kind of special forces kind of dudes, and some Americans, and found or kind of went into like what was putatively an oil pumping station or something, and in the eyewitnesses or the kind of the reports go that this didn't look quite like an oil pumping station or not even a pumping station, just a kind of a pipeline maintenance unit stuck out here in this island where nothing else ever goes, and that when these squaddies like explored this facility, they found some very strange things like refrigerated canisters of something which, upon the limited inspection they were able to give it, was something like a black goo, a black oil-like substance, which seemed to have certain strange, maybe psychoreactive properties. Basically, it was weird shit in these canisters, and the dudes who were sort of sent to kind of pick up the weird shit were very quickly hushed up, pushed away from it. The canisters were stuck on a big ass container ship sent back to the UK, and they blew up with like extreme prejudice this otherwise tactically unimportant oil facility or whatever, just like, could have just been whatever it was. They blew it up in a kind of like overkill kind of way. Like they didn't want anybody to go digging around in whatever this place had been after they'd got this weird shit out of there. Fast forward up to now, and there are fewer of these people around who were on that mission who had contact with this black shit than average, should we say. It was maybe not a terribly good idea to get involved with this stuff. Rewind back again to about 5 years after the Falklands War ended, 5 years after this one-off mission on Thule Island, and this is the bit where the story takes a leap, which I'm not very clear on. Basically, the Marconi deaths happened. Now, the Marconi deaths is something which was kind of covered in the news at the time, and the reason that I kind of even think about it in relation to the Invisibles at all, and when the Invisibles mentions the Falklands at all, is that the Marconi deaths was like a kind of a Sunday tabloid conspiracy sensation in the UK as it was happening, and Grant Morrison was interested in it because he makes it a plot point, in a thinly veiled plot point, with alien goo as another plot point in his comic that he made with Ryan Hughes. Ryan Hughes, remember, is the chap who did our Invisibles logo here, called Dare, which is like a like a pop art 80s grim and gritty reboot of Dan Dare. And goes into interesting territories with regard to Thatcherism and, kind of like Britain's post-imperial malaise. Post-militaristic malaise, yeah? A bunch of guys, scientists and engineers, working at the Marconi facility, sort of around like Gloucestershire or somewhere, were hit by like a spate of mysterious deaths and suicides, basically, which to anybody who's ever seen a film looks a bit like somebody's trying to kill them off for whatever reason. Which, in my view, like depression and suicide are a bit contagious. I know that that's an unscientific statement, but also it's a bit true. And so that might explain an otherwise quite peculiar cluster of early deaths. Some of them were like very brutal forms of suicide, like people like tying a rope around your neck and putting your foot down on the accelerator and tying another end of the rope to a lamppost, that kind of thing. People who had no sort of profile for suicide or whatever, kind of throwing themselves off the Clifton Suspension Bridge, that kind of thing. But within the course of a few months, a bunch of people who were working for or subcontracted to the Marconi company, who obviously were famous for like very early experiment and very early infrastructure work in telecommunications. So like the first exchanges across the Atlantic was all done by Marconi. The first radio wave signals that were successfully sent were by Marconi. At the start of the 20th century, Marconi were very much the Apple of their day, yeah. And hugely wealthy. Like they've since been absorbed into. Was I smart enough to make a note? I wonder, dear listener, was I smart enough to make a note of the company that they all got absorbed into? No, I don't think I was. I do apologise. Maybe I'll put it in the notes or something. In the notes. So Marconi aren't there anymore, but they were basically in the 80s. They were working on computer tech, for want of a better word. And I don't know, and this is the bit I was saying a minute ago, I don't know where the leap happens between the black goo getting out of Thule Island and the scientists who work for Marconi all dying in weird circumstances, but in the way that these stories tend to kind of have a meandering and overlapping life of their own, these two stories have become entangled. And the narrative goes, this weird shit that they found in Thule Island had some kind of strange properties, perhaps it could destroy your mind properties, perhaps somewhat electroconductive, whatever. It went to Marconi, they studied it, and either something in its nature made these people kill themselves, or the tech that it enabled, that we kind of were able to build from it, wanted to have its secrets kept. Like when you've got and really, I don't know what the implication is. The implication is basically the internet, touchscreen technology, something really sort of, or like plasma screens, something which is now totally ubiquitous, but at the time was really like, oh my goodness, this is really big technology, and we need to get our fingers in here. The kind of thing that maybe once you'd established it and kind of built a use case for it, the people who knew how to make it work and could potentially take that information to one of your competitors, those guys needed to be taken out of the picture. That kind of thing. It has a similar resonance to like latter day interpretations of something like the Roswell incident, or basically like the kind of the mid to late 20th century American UFO situation, which is that, so like maybe something weird happened, and maybe that something weird is no weirder than some government contractual shenanigans as they start to funnel a load of public cash into the private sector as a way of basically enriching a bunch of private individuals in a way which is kind of basically illegal, and so therefore needs to be covered up and disinfoized with stories about UFOs. But basically that certain radical technologies which entered kind of the mainstream at the end of the 20th century had some kind of unusual point of origin. Now, that unusual point of origin may be a crashed flying saucer in the New Mexico desert that we built stealth fighters from, or it might be some black goo that had weird conductive properties which we were able to turn into plasma screens, or something like that. So this is kind of a thread and a strand. All of this we'll get to in book 2 of The Invisibles in about 2 years' time or something. But that's kind of a significant myth theme in Western conspiracy narratives, that the tech that we now take for granted, and which, as I've been saying in every episode, is part of the control matrix that we all live in, and obviously this extends to the systems that I'm recording this on and that I'm sharing it to you with. All of this weird planetary changing stuff, this stuff which has, messed up our social relations in our minds, and obviously had many improvements too, had many advantages. When we'll get to that later, we'll get to the ways which social media can really, and like digital technology can maybe fuck your head up. We'll get to that in a bit. But as I've been saying, there is definitely like a spooky narrative at work there, which, if not kind of like technically true, because maybe there aren't flying saucers, there are, but maybe there aren't, has nevertheless, because of like the uncanny effects it's had on this end of our experience, it kind of makes sense that people are retrofitting a spooky origin for this technology too, right? And one of those spooky origin stories happens to start in the Falklands. Now, if not for the weird Prince Andrew Falklands reptile conspiracy thing that happened this week, not for the fact that I hadn't thought about the Falklands for ages, but then realised that there's quite a big, if oblique, deal made of it in this issue, I wouldn't have bothered mentioning that. Oh, and for the fact that it does connect to some of the secret underground base, military industrial complex stuff that I know happens in the second book of The Invisibles, I wouldn't have put it together. Oh, and the Marconi deaths and the Dare thing. However, I do think that there's maybe a strand of that conspiracy theory at work in the background of this episode of The Invisibles. When I say the black goo as being this kind of like strange oil gunk stuff, I don't know, we'll get to the black goo. Like, the black goo pops up again in a few issues time in The Invisibles. It's, the black goo in the X-Files, the black goo that you get in the like Venom, the Spider-Man baddie is made from. Like, black goo is a motif in the last 15, 20, 25 years of Western pop culture, which you may not have noticed, but once you start to think about it, there's loads of it. There's loads of black goo as being like a weird monster villain in our cultural imaginary, right? Maybe that's accounted for by just these black panels in this issue, although, in the more obvious kind of straightforward narrative sense, that's like Bobby Murray blacking out as he's kind of suffering from the effects of being blown up in the Falklands, frankly. There's a big explosion goes off in the Falklands, maybe enough to level a alien goo processing facility. He gets hurt, he falls down. Obviously, this is very much this is like his fantasy of what it's like to be killed when you're a little boy pretending to be a soldier and becoming a soldier who gets blown up and is maybe thinking he's dying. Yeah, that's narrative, guys. That's storytelling. And yeah, I've said it already, but I'll say it again. Storytelling in this issue, it's not my favourite issue, and I think it has some flaws in it, but the way that it stitches together and bangs around through Bobby Murray's life is like, it's great storytelling. It's great comics. It's really well done. Steve Parkhouse and Grant Morrison coming together very well here. So we get like I'm going to keep saying smash cut, even though I don't really know if smash cut is the right word for it, but I'm going to keep saying it because it's really good fun to say. We smash cut from this explosion in the sky, a panel of black goo, onto this panel here on page 3, where the explosions that are going off all around Bobby aren't scary munitions anymore, but they are fireworks, and we're suddenly back in Bobby's childhood again, and it's bonfire night, November the 5th, Guy Fawkes. I'm sure I don't need to explain, the folk conspiracy narratives around Guy Fawkes night, and how they've become significant again in the 20th century, thanks to Grant Morrison's archenemy, Alan Moore. There's this wonderful Roman candle which they're watching. They're all standing really. This is like a funny scene, basically. Although it's all like very deep and like portentous and meaningful, it's actually quite funny, and they're having quite a lot of fun. And there's a good sense of humour at work, if a slightly bitter one, in this entire issue. But we get this Roman candle. Why are they called Roman candles? I definitely looked that up. I'm thinking Vulcan. I'm talking about like sort of a fatalism and a militarism expressed by the like the martial Roman understanding of the god Vulcan, and how he applied to like the lethal and weapon making capacity of fire to produce imperial hegemony. And that important like secret that like one of the ways that you create an empire out of a city like Rome is you learn how to make really good steel, and to make really good steel you need really good fires, and that's where gods like Vulcan and the kind of the cultus and the corpus of knowledge hidden within the Vulcan cult that would have existed in Rome at the time, why that's a part of their culture, why that's a part of the way that they do things, why they have a bunch of soldiers who, rather than learning how to kill, probably spend their time learning how to create weapons instead, and they factor that knowledge into its own sort of set of relations and practices, and they call that volcanism. They call that worship of the volcano god Vulcan. I think that's maybe maybe I'm reading a bit too much into this page at this stage, but here we are. Welcome to the Visible Podcast, and that's kind of also we're really being begged here. This is one of those issues of the Invisibles, which is like there's no fat in the narrative whatsoever. Every single panel and every single line is like really begging you to look twice, three times a lady at it for some hidden significance. We can see that Bobby is playing with a balloon. You'll remember the balloon from issue 5, when King Mob is on the Golden Gate Bridge and he lets it go. That was a motif as itself being borrowed from the film of the Subterraneans that King Mob refers to at the time. Balloons are aspirations, they're hopes, they're one's innocence, they're one's better nature. And Bobby makes the perhaps fatal mistake here of allowing his better nature to go and play with explosions in the sky. And there's one of the things, obviously, like there's a real like important theme of like free will versus determinism going through this entire issue. This is a bit like a kind of a dramatized exploration of the dialectic that Shelley and Byron are talking about when they're talking about whether we sort of wish our better selves into being, or whether they're just a kind of a result of getting by and making do and the external factors which push upon us. This one kind of maybe synthesizes the dialectic by sort of saying not just it's both, but that like we do create our future for ourselves, we just don't know we're doing it. Yeah, that's definitely one of the ways of reading this, and the way that we do that is through these acts of coincidence, happenstance, and the way that coincidence and happenstance from a slightly kind of upstream perspective can look like fate, or can even look like magic. It's a bit like, because we know what this balloon signifies, and we'll see it again later, because we know what this balloon signifies, the fact that it's juxtaposed with these explosions makes you think, if he hadn't let his dreams and hopes go to play with the fireworks, maybe he wouldn't be spending his grown-up life playing with fireworks. So that's, although it's not willed, It is magic, yeah? Like, Bobby has done something which has created his own future. As kind of as terrifying and horrifying a thought as that is, that like that kind of completely unconsidered actions that one has when one's childhood could kind of select a tendency within one's future that is thereafter inescapable. It's terrifying and actually kind of monstrous. Not just because it's not just determinism. It's like you're your own devil creating the worst possible determinism for you. Or, you know, maybe you're your own holy god angel building yourself a stairway to heaven. You know, it's a little bit of both. And of course, chaos and circumstance has its effect too. I'm sure, you know, this is what Shelley and Byron would have probably settled on if they hadn't got killed in Greece or, you know, drowned having a swim. Anyway, yeah, this page is really funny. Because this great detail here where he is Bobby's dad, who we don't see much of, but we know we don't like, is smoking a fag while like digging through the box of fireworks. Now, and he's singing the fireworks advert song here as well. A bit before my time, if we're honest. But certainly around this time and prior to this in the 80s, like more so than fireworks and bonfires, the memory that people have of what bonfire night is like is the safety adverts. I would even go so far as to mention that in around this period, around 95 when this comic is coming out, I'm pretty sure that like the mascot for firework safety is like an alien called Sparky, and he's a little green man. He's basically a grey, a green grey, kind of that colour. Who teaches you how to do firework safety. And obviously the main thing of firework safety is that you don't smoke a fag while sorting out which firework you're going to pick out of the box, right? So that's kind of funny because this is obviously because we're meant to spot that because we're harkening back to a kind of a pre-health and safety era, which is, you know, Bobby's childhood basically takes place in the late 60s, basically like mid to late 60s, and maybe actually probably a bit later by this point. This kind of like picture of family bonhomie gathered around the firework in like more carefree days is actually sort of screams early 70s. You know, that kind of that period after that period that was kind of underpinned by glam, where there was this kind of sense, and before like the winter of discontent, where basically British people kind of liked each other and liked getting on and liked going to the pub and liked, you know, not to say that there weren't undercurrents of violence and bad shit going on, but there was a bonhomie in the air. There was a conviviality that was kind of engendered by, you know, not being at war, having had a couple of decades of peace and prosperity, decent trade unions, decent pension pots. You know, all the stuff that people took for granted then and we don't have now, which makes us also pissed off about stuff. Here, they all had it and they took it for granted and were like, this is great. We can basically just get drunk and live okay with each other. And obviously nothing, it wasn't like all rosy, but there was, you know, the cultural moment is remembered now as a exuberant, convivial one. So yeah, it's very funny. They're all smoking fags and lighting fireworks, and and Bobby, like I say, he lets his balloon, which is his dreams and aspirations, go to play with the fireworks. Oh, Bobby, look what you've done! You've lost your balloon, you wee daft wee bugger. We're in Scotland. It's no lost. I'm letting you play with the fireworks. Bad idea, Bobby. Over onto the next page, we've got our next advert. Super Guards. To make it more realistic, we'd have to kick dust in your face. So, you know, every advert tells a story. This advert is telling the story of, like, our screenshots are terrible, so we're going to tell you that the game's good with words, which tends not to work terribly well. Or at least it's funny, right? So good adverts work within their medium. One of the good things about a comic book is that you want to read it. So, you know, although people would look at this now and tear this advert apart for the kind of the mistake it has in relying too much on all of this written information, actually, within the context of a comic book, that's, you know, when you've read the comic book, you've finished the story, you're bored, you're looking for another you've got a couple more minutes to kill, this advert would actually do the job quite well. But yeah, it's like it's a slightly cut game. So within the context of knowing and saying that every advert in the Invisibles is about the Invisibles, it's only a game. Yeah, one of our mysterious floating captions on page 1. It's only a game. To make it more realistic, we'd have to kick dust in your face. So we're talking about some kind of like ultra reality game. Invisibles readers, pay attention. I mean, I don't even know what this game was for. It was basically a PC game. It wasn't even for the Mega Drive or whatever. It looks terrible. But I'm sure at the time everybody had a good time with it. On CD-ROM for IBM PC and compatibles. Supercards. And this is like a picture of a grown man in a go-kart, and it's a bit like, get a car? Yeah. Over on the other page, we've got our next advert here. We've got it's our Sam Goody Music Land advert. Good old Sam. The albums that they're advertising this month are Rubberneck by the Toadies, or by Toadies. Cool cover. Kind of this like flying rockabilly guy. And About Time by Pennywise. Time bomb ready to go up. I enjoyed the Toadies album. Not terribly easy to find, but well, you know, it's not on Spotify. You've got to YouTube it, and it's not even all in one go on YouTube. But somebody's had to stitch a playlist together out of it. So fair play to you, thanks. I enjoyed Toadies. They sounded like a really amazing local band who would do amazing gigs within convenient travel distance, and you'd go and see them all the time, and they'd make you very happy, and you'd be guaranteed a good night out. And I really like bands like that. So fair play to the Toadies for Rubberneck. One of the tracks on there, I can't remember what it's called now, but one of the tracks on there was like a minor hit, and is kind of great. You know, kind of got a good hook and a catchy chorus, and you're like, yeah, I bet when they played that towards the end of the set, I bet it went off, but it was really good. Kind of, yeah, like lots of good sort of exuberant rock energy without being too sort of bratty. Nice kind of almost like a dusty country feel, but not quite, but very much like exuberant high energy college rock. Yeah, I enjoyed it. With a kind of sense of humour and stuff. Yeah, it was fun. However, by the time I got to Pennywise, I'd already done one album of like American alt rock. I managed about 2 tracks of the Pennywise album and gave up. Sorry Pennywise, didn't like your album. You'll get over it, it's fine. Back into our story. It's the day after, presumably. Could have been the next. Yeah, I mean, has he got the same jacket on? Let me double check. Yeah, Bobby's still got his red coat. So it is the next day. And enter Bobby's evil brother, Stewie. So they're kind of like in the way that you do. They're in the garden, picking over all of the old fireworks to look at them, shaking out all the burnt firework powder in there and going, ooh, and kind of thinking maybe it'll still work. And, you know, there is something cool about a rocket. There's something cool about a rocket. But they hear Stewie come in, and they know they're in for trouble because Stewie's an asshole. And they, Bobby's kind of aspirational, albeit exhausted rocket is juxtaposed with Stewie's rampant wreck, should we say, sharp stick, which is altogether more kind of a brutal image of what his aspiration, or what his kind of, where his tendencies lie. But Houston, we're just looking for dead fireworks, Stu. And basically, in a way which is kind of like no more evil than what a lot of young boys do, but is nevertheless kind of evil. Stewie just like really hurts his little brother. Basically, we kind of like does this nasty sort of trick to him that makes him mash his knees against the. Cause you can, I don't know if you've kind of got this where you live, reader, but like I can picture that kind of knobbly whitewashed. It's not quite pebble dashing, but maybe it is pebble dashing that's been whitewashed. Finish on a wall. I can picture that from being a kid quite clearly, and mashing your knees against it is incredibly painful. and Stewie does it. It seems like a small thing to mention, but Stewie's sadism here and his kind of like, basically one of the all of the stuff I was just saying about whether you're your own devil or your own angel, kind of draws attention to the fact that there's this kind of like this kind of chaotic universe that you live in as well, which also dictates many of the things which you may interpret as choices, but they're more like circumstances, right? It's more like shit happening. And this episode goes to great lengths to kind of paint the descent into evil as just as kind of normal, kind of just like irresistible, and but also very complex and kind of accidental, chaotic, and kind of suggests a thesis of like we're all angels, but the accumulating shit of life can make you a devil. The problem, and this kind of gives us this very sort of sympathetic lens to look at Bobby Murray's life. But I think the way that the story in the telling kind of is weak, is in the character of Stewie, because Bobby is a beautiful innocent soul who kind of, which is slowly chipped away, and he slowly descends into a very sort of banal form of evil. Stewie's just evil. Like there's no sort of grasp of what Stewie's slow descent is. He's just evil. There is a nod to it in a couple of pages' time about what Stewie's descent was about, but it's unconvincing. It's tossed off and half-assed. Basically, the story sort of decides it needs a baddie, so it creates one in the form of Stewie, and so his character doesn't have any form of realistic inner life at all, and we're meant to be very, very concerned about the intricacies of Bobby's inner life, right? So it makes the story itself feel artificial for a story which is really piling on the signifiers of realism and really trying to get you to believe in this person as a normal guy. The only way it can do that is by giving you a abnormal guy, just an evil person, for his normalness to kind of bounce off against, which kind of undercuts its own thesis, right? So Stewie's character doesn't work really. Over the page, we flash forward to middle young adulthood, and Stewie dies. Stewie's been in a car crash, and Bobby is kind of like trying to comfort him. Obviously, I mean, this is the most okay. So we start off here with Audrey, who we haven't met yet, but this is Audrey. This is the first time we see her. This is Bobby's wife, and she's being quietly ushered out of the room with a black eye. We can maybe think now. Unfortunately, Audrey kind of gets used, has black eyes a lot, thanks to Bobby. And the really horrible implication in this panel could be that, obviously Bobby's upset because his brother's just crashed his car and is in a really bad way. Maybe that black eye is not just fresh, but really fresh. Maybe it's literally happened immediately prior to the nurse going, "Oh crumbs," and getting Audrey out of there. Which is awful that he could abuse his wife like that and still be allowed in the hospital. There's one of the things this issue does really well is kind of pointing you towards these really chilling ways in which forms of abuse and violence are normalized, and there's a lot of that work in this panel if you read this bit here in a certain way. And Bobby kind of is Bobby's got a heart of gold. So he is trying to see. So he tells his brother that he loves him. because he kind of feels that this is probably the last chance that he will ever get to say that, and he hopes to be giving Stewie some sort of like reason to pull through from this kind of like these terrible injuries that he's got. And Stewie basically summons the effort to say one last word, and he basically says, "I fucking hate you, and I always have," and then he dies. Beep, and then he dies. And the expression on Bobby's face here is really good. You know, he's really like, Bobby's really gone here. Something like a really big part of Bobby's goodness has died with his evil brother. But again, it does also reinforce this kind of slightly cartoonish aspect that Stewie has, which is that he's just fucking evil. He's just really evil, and like he's defined by how evil he is, and his life has been about how much he hates his younger brother. And as I've just explained, doesn't kind of work with the grain of the story itself. I think this is probably Bobby's, and then onto the next page, this is where we get the nod to Stewie's problem, if you like. We are in this kind of idyllic birthday scene. All of these lovely bubbles are floating around because Audrey is, or maybe Bobby's gran. Or maybe. That's interesting, actually. I hadn't really noticed that. But it looks like somebody's been blowing bubbles all around the room. Bubbles, a bit like balloons, are like a kind of a somewhat frequent motif in the Invisible's cosmology. Bubbles are sort of, are again like spirits or concepts or functions within the text, figured in the text, that are kind of around and can be grasped or can intrude on the fabric of the text at any point. What's really interesting to note here is that no one's actually holding like a bubble blower, and maybe the bubbles aren't there in the actual room when they're singing happy birthday to Bobby. Maybe only Bobby can see these bubbles. Maybe they're only there for him. And they're all like, "Oh!" They're all cooing over him. He's got an Auntie Alice who has brought him this slightly creepy teddy bear. I don't want to send you down any rabbit holes unnecessarily, but like teddy bears and teddy bears are like in the work of Stanley Kubrick. Lots of people think that in the work of Stanley Kubrick, teddy bears kind of stand in for child abuse, basically, and they're a symbol of that you weave into the text, because obviously it's like it's a cuddly, it's a nice thing that a kid plays with, but actually a bear lives in the woods and is terrifying. Yeah, so there's maybe a little touch of that. Bobby's mum, who looks a little bit like Bobby's wife, says, "Oh, look what your Auntie Alice has brought you." So again, I think we have another little hint at child abuse there with the kind of like the dream terror of Alice from Alice in Wonderland. Bobby's mum is wearing an Alice band as well. I think there's a reasonable amount going on beneath the surface of this page here. One of the things that's going on beneath them, in fact, the abuse here that's being alluded to by the symbol of the teddy bear could just be the abuse that Stewie habitually meted out to Bobby, because the bear is eclipsing Stewie's face here, and basically Stewie's a couple of years older or whatever, maybe 3 or 4 years older, and he's like, "Can I have a present as well?" And their mum is like, "Oh, shush, Stewie, it's not your birthday," which is classic and in my opinion, fairly glib sort of like older child resentment-y stuff about why an older child would hate their younger sibling. I'm the youngest of 3. I've never had that vibe at all. I think that Morrison realises that he's got to explain why Stewie's such an asshole at some point here, and kind of does this to sort of cover his back. But again, it's unconvincing. Because of the lavished attention upon Bobby's soul, to be told that Stewie's soul is evil because, he wanted to get a present and didn't once. It's not enough. The story sort of stumbles there, really. And then we have this weird panel here. Bobby is like pleased with his teddy bear and is saying baby noises like ma and ka, these unformed root language phonemes, these just kind of this baby talk, this glossolalia, these just these. Bleh. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead for a spoiler. One of the things that bubbles signifies in the Invisibles is words. That like a word has a like a platonic other dimensional existence, which is where our words go or where our words live. Yeah. And that's what bubbles signify. So he's making he's doing this baby talk here, ma ka, and like he's maybe like chewing the fundaments of language and reality for him into being through these magic words. Yeah. We also have this weird speech bubble here. Edith says to call on Booty. And it's completely out of nowhere, and it's all very weird. And Bobby and Stewie's mum is like, "What? Did he just say something?" And Auntie Alice is like, "Don't be daft. It's just your imagination, Ina." Oh, okay. Sorry. Bobby's mum is called Ina, or Ina, perhaps. One. The one. She's the one. The mother is the one that the things come from, yeah? Edith says to call him Booty. Now, that's obviously like, whoa, that's meant to make us kind of think, and it obviously takes us back out of this intimate, self-contained story into the wider Invisibles thing. You'll remember that Edith is the name of the old woman that King Bob is talking to in issue 1 of the Invisibles. And, obviously there's not going to be 2 characters called Edith, and it's not going to be a coincidence that it's Edith. So somehow Edith is in the room and telling Bobby to call his teddy bear Booty. I'm going to do another. I've already just done one, so I'll do another one here. Another bit of spoilers for this issue and for a bit further into the Invisibles. Actually, it's not really a spoiler for further on. It's just a spoiler for this issue. The bit that like basically Bobby Murray is maybe a Dane McGowan who went wrong, and the Invisibles were kind of maybe in the background of his life, trying to, bring his innate, magic powers and Buddha-ness out, his savior, messiah, qualities, the things that we think Dane might be bundling up inside him. The Invisibles were maybe trying to do this to Bobby, but it went wrong. I think these things here are creepy. We've got a clown, a fish, and a moon. You could definitely do yourself a little podcast about the symbols of the clown and the fish and the moon being creepy and kind of being like a constellation of omens that are having a mixture of influences over Bobby's life. But I don't think we need to do that here, do we? I don't think we need to do that here. The clown thing, another thing that happened since I recorded an episode of this in the last month, was that the Joker movie came out, so clowns became a thing again. But we'll get to that later. Okay, flash forward. It's Ina's funeral. Bobby's a grown-up. We don't see Bobby's dad again. In fact, Bobby's dad might not even be at the funeral, but he does have a representative or somebody who knows him at the funeral, which is pipe smoking dude here, who is maybe who is probably this guy here from the firework party when they were kids. Probably like an uncle or something, isn't it? Probably or a friend of the family, somebody who knows their dad. Thank God your dad's taking it awful bad. Thank God Stuart's still looking after him, eh? So there's a little bit of that's maybe another of the things that's made Stewie go evil, is that he's kind of been burdened with having to look after his grieving dad. We learn a little bit about Bobby's mum's background here. This guy can remember when they were all in the Anderson shelter. So this hooks us back into the Second World War and the kind of the final flourishing of like Britain's imperial war machine, if you like. Anderson shelters were like the bomb shelters that people built in their back gardens to sort of avoid being buried in the rubble of their family if their house should get hit by a bomb. This is all set in Glasgow. Well, I don't think it's ever actually specified that it's Glasgow. I think we can infer quite comfortably that it's Glasgow from Grant Morrison's own biography, which this is obviously intended to reflect, if not match, obviously, in some way. But the kind of the cultural references and memories and history that's being evoked in this episode maps pretty well with Grant Morrison's life and you know, lifetime, should we say. The Anderson, the bombs had falling, and she would sing that song, Ain't She Sweet. Ain't She Sweet is a Beatles song. It was a standard that they were doing during the period in Hamburg and stuff, which is what they would have been playing in their sets about the time that Dane saw John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe on his vision in the Mersey dockside in issue 1, right? So the Beatles are still here, even though they are not represented in the kind of psychedelic, positive, good guy kind of way, or just kind of like lifey, you know, the vital way that they are, because here they're being clearly associated with the passing of Ina Murray, Bobby and Stewie's dad. Bobby's got a stick here. I think he's just got a walking stick. This is because he's either recovering or is permanently wounded by the bit here in the Falklands. Yeah, he survives it, but maybe not 100% intact. The walking stick connects on the visual vertical here to this spade, which Bobby presumably's foot is ramming into the earth here. Which itself connects, you know, Steve Parkhouse's art is full of these sort of storytelling details, which, whether they're scripted or not, you know, work really well. His style looks kind of broad and like it doesn't fret these small details, but actually he really does, and it's fantastic. It feels very loose and easy, but actually in it it's very tight and detailed. This rather violent kind of like breaking the earth motion that we've got with his foot here connects to the previous panel, where a woman who we presume is probably Auntie Alice from the previous page, much older, is asking Audrey why she's got a black eye again. She knows, obviously, really, she knows why he's got a black eye, and kind of like to imagine, you know, you can see the kind of the weight of the occasion on this guy's face. You can also see the weight of concern on Auntie Alice's face, knowing that the baby boy who she was cooing over, you know, literally just a page turn ago, knows that he's now grown up into a woman, you know, somebody who beats his wife, an abuser. She asks why she's got a horrible bruise that she's hiding behind these sunglasses. Audrey says, "Oh, it was nothing. I slipped on the stairs and hit myself on the banisters, or whatever." And then we see, and she mentions her high heels. We see his big army boot heels smacking into the spade, and the juxtaposition is horrible and very well done. So maybe he doesn't. So he hasn't even punched her. He's kicked her in the face. So yeah, he's a very bad guy. Which is which we again get here, where. You know, obviously to kind of give Bobby some comfort and to recognise his war wound. Uncle Frog here says, "You're a hero. Like, you should be proud of yourself. Your mammy would be proud of you." And he goes, "Well, yeah, right," because he knows he's not a hero by this point. You know, Bobby. This is clearly into the. You know, we're pretty well into Bobby being a bad guy by this stage. We've got another advert for our favourite, you know, fantasy publishing house, White Wolf Publishing. On the next page, The Splendor Falls. What did I think about this advert? So I like this kind of stained glass window effect picture of this rampant wyvern. An anthology of short stories, The Splendor Falls exposes the hidden population of changelings, half human, half fae, who reside in the world of darkness. It's like the Invisibles. And also, this advert, the second half of the advert, which is for the book Breathe Deeply, which has got this kind of painted goblin style, is notable because, again, it's about the battle continues. Gaia's warriors must face the powerful embodiment of the evil worm, the giant corporation Pentex. It's a bit like the Invisibles. But there's a bit like... there's a bit of bitch type, basically. They haven't proofed it properly, and it says bracket World of Darkness logo in the middle of the copy, where they meant White Wolf. The World of Darkness logo probably should have gone in this gap here. So there's an amusing error there, but it's fine. Everybody involved has long since forgotten and forgiven that. Although somebody probably did get into trouble. I hope they didn't. I hope the graphics designer or the proofreader or whoever, or the printer or whoever, didn't get into too much trouble over that. Innocent and easy error. Another advert on the flip side of that page. It's an advert for Ugly Kid Joe's Menace to Sobriety album. So, quick review. I thought this was okay. For like, they became famous as like a sort of a, right, in the UK. They were probably huge in America, but Ugly Kid Joe, I hate everything about you, like a novelty grunge song, but which was on a later album than this. This I'm pretty sure, or maybe earlier. No, I'm pretty sure it was later album than this. Although they're still rock punk guys. There's a funny picture of like a German lad at Oktoberfest here who's far too young to be drinking such a big glass of beer, but he is. And that's Menace to Sobriety by Ugly Kid Joe. I thought it was okay. It was a while ago that I listened to it now. It didn't have any of the hits of Ugly Kid Joe's that I recognised on it. It did get their other hit record that they had over here was The Cat's in the Cradle and the Silver Spoon, Little Boy Blue and the Man on the Moon, which is a really annoying song, which was in my head and which I successfully managed to transmit into my wife's head over the course of this past month because I listened to an Ugly Kid Joe record. Not even this one, but just the words Ugly Kid Joe were enough to put that song in my head for a couple of days, and that was annoying. I did not enjoy. This album was all right. It was fairly, again, it was quite exuberant, sort of like, grungy alt rock. It was all right, with a fairly sort of like knockabout kind of wink to it. This page is really interesting though. This horrible picture on it, like it's an even sort of more visual than the boy getting drunk, which I just don't think you'd be allowed to do these days. I don't think you'd be allowed to encourage reckless drinking in such a way as that. I really don't. But this like drunk party clown who's on fire and loving it, with all the beer cans and his belly and his pointy ears. It's basically it's a fire demon, but also like a fire joker, right? This is a very jokery, clowny, evil. We live in a sobriety style Joker avatar image here. It's really scary. It's really good. It's a really great picture here. A really good little avatar of chaos. In a kind of nasty way. Like he's half leprechaun, half Loki, half Joker. It's a really good picture. And to be reading this with all of that, explosive, exuberant energy. I'm using the word exuberant a lot this episode. I apologize. I don't apologize. Reading this at the same time as the Joker movie was coming out was, again, one of those nice little sinks that you get when you probe into what is obviously a magical item, yeah? Like Invisibles comics, I'm sure I've said this before, they're basically little magic spells. And if you dip into them, they dip back. And that maybe comes with risks, although, touch wood, I'm alive, so thanks for worrying. If you've got any jobs, I'll take it. Speaking of which, Bobby, we're flashing back to like late teen, early adult, like early 20s Bobby here, I would say. He's leaving Scotland to go and make his fortune in that London. Stewie, in his typical evil way, is taking the piss. Again, we've got like mid-70s here. They've got very mid-70s haircuts. Everyone's puffing away on fags. They're both dressed in a kind of a sort of a casual utilitarian way, which suggests they have, they work in good old. They're in good like secondary sector employment, right? They work in factories or they do manual labour. They're like solid blue collar guys. He's literally got a blue collar. But Bobby's got ambitions too, right? He did let his balloon go into the stratosphere to risk life playing with rockets. Remember, whereas Stewie doesn't have any of those kind of ambitions. He doesn't really have any ambitions beyond hating Stewie. He was quite happy for hating Bobby. He was quite happy for the culmination of his life to be. Oh, not happy, but he made sure that the culmination of his life was to reinforce his hatred for his brother. He teases him about Booty, the teddy bear, in a very satisfying and very brilliantly drawn. That's a hell of a punch panel. That's a punch panel, and it's a hell of a one. And you don't really think, Steve Parkhouse has got there's this kind of like approachability to his style that doesn't make you think that he's gonna be able to deliver a really like painful shot like that. But the way he does, and the way he seems to punch Booty, his beloved teddy bear, and his brother in one really, energetic swipe. I think probably the anatomy's off because his hip and his hand seem, the hip and his hip and his shoulder are sort of pointing in counter to each other. So all of the strength in the punch we can assume was coming from the shoulder rather than from his body. But compositionally it looks great, and it really kind of stings. It's a good punch panel. But he not only in knocking out in taking this very satisfying kind of moment of violent revenge against his brother, he also takes this bit of revenge against like I say, it's a symbol of innocence which he throws in the bin. Note the symbolism, but it's not a terribly innocent symbol to begin with. Yeah, maybe it codes the abuse that's existed between them, and in which case the binning symbolism doesn't quite work because he doesn't really escape the abuse and resentment between him and Stewie by dumping the broken booty, which is maybe a symbol of innocence, maybe a symbol of abuse, maybe both. That's the point, in the bin. Over on the page, we've got more punching, we've got more violence, though we can't see it now. It's all happening off panel. Presumably, so we can see that this is Bobby back when he's a kid. The dog, can't remember the dog's name. We'll find out in a minute. Is asleep here. Bobby is trying to get to sleep here. We can probably assume that Stewie's up here in the top bunk, hearing everything that goes on. And the top bunk is generally, I don't know, is the top bunk the better bunk? I don't know. But we've got our creepy clown again. They keep popping up on the pages in this issue. All three of them, we can presume they can hear. It's horrible. It's a horrible scene. Well done again. Bobby and Stewie's dad is drunk. He's downstairs beating up their mum. And in this very sort of like poignant and well, and sad panel here, Bobby is kind of like expressing his own fear and sadness through his own desire. He's play acting with Booty, the benevolent protector figure that he wishes his dad was. And on the second, there's a bit of jumping around, but on the final panel of this spread, Bobby kind of says, "Don't worry, Booty, I'll never let anything bad happen to you. I love you, Booty." This is a real moment of emotional enactment transference occurring between Bobby and his abandoned teddy bear, which kind of retroactively makes it a bit more poignant, because this is where, this teddy bear was kind of where Bobby had invested his hopes to be a better man, and then they end up in the bin. We get a flash to Carefree. We see the ominous spade again, which presumably isn't digging Bobby's mum's grave, even though we see it in the funeral scene, because that's, that looks more like a crematorium than a church, if you know what I mean. There's probably not a big grave for Ina Marie, Bobby's mum. She's singing the song which we know she sings. We've got these post-war flats, which are which are simultaneously a symbol of like post-war optimism and not. Although much has been done in recent years to reclaim the conceptual underpinnings of these kind of high-rise estates as viable forms of modern housing and modern living. Certainly in the 90s, these were symbols of of squalor and of deprivation. Actually, they're kind of not, but like in the 90s, these council flats were uncool. Nowadays, they're quite cool again because public housing is good. But downstairs, Bobby and Stewie's dad is drunk. They can hear him beating their mum. She's singing the Beatles song, Ain't She Sweet? It ain't a Beatles song, but the Beatles did it. At this point, there's a pretty good chance that Ina Marie is singing the Beatles version rather than any of the many versions which would have been extant within Ina's lifetime. Then we have another sort of primal scene here. There's a little bit of a leap between these two panels. So we've got Bobby being very innocent, playing with a daffodil. Remember how daffodils represent stars in the Invisibles imaginary, and not just like stars as in like physical stars, but stars as in the the cosmic architecture that we exist in. Bobby is serenely contemplating and enjoying it. There's this little, it's probably just like a seed pod from something, that just like floats on this warm summer air, although there is a bit of a breeze, and it's never that warm in Glasgow, is it? And it does this interesting thing, right? Suddenly, I don't know if it's, I don't quite get what's happening here, but and I think it's maybe just an effective memory, is that this is happening in one time period, and okay, so because we can assume that this is all happening while Bobby is kind of like flashing back through his life, right? So although these look like they could very much be the same moment, I think it's just like there were lots of nice, like Bobby is remembering this is one of lots of nice moments in the garden. One of these moments in the garden where the washing wasn't there and where he wasn't playing with a daffodil but was enjoying the presence of a bee, darkened and became him being terrorized by his asshole brother again, who's found this gas mask in here and is dressing up as a scary monster to come and frighten his little brother again, which he just does. Then we get another flash of Bobby suffering in Port Stanley or wherever it is. The Falklands conflict was it was quite short, and like the body count wasn't huge, and that kind of nothing compared to Vietnam or the lesser conflicts after the Second World War. Nothing compared to Afghanistan or Iraq. But definitely, a few hundred British soldiers lost their lives, and the report is, the way they speak about it is that much of the fighting was like proper fighting. It was quite, those who did fight, although it's a fairly small number of them, because the units that the war was over before like many divisions got involved. Those divisions that did see action, the action they saw was quite up close, quite bloody, kind of, obviously people don't talk about it very much because obviously it's not very nice, but maybe hand to hand, you're basically in these horrible wet fields a million miles from anywhere for no reason, fighting a guy to the death. You could see his eyes, he could see yours. Like, not many soldiers, obviously too many soldiers died in this stupid war, and they died bad, yeah. And those that live to tell the tale don't tell the tale because it's a bad tale. The fighting was ugly and up close. Although Bobby has been hit by a shell here. There's nothing to say that he was kind of like jabbing a knife into somebody's guts, although I think that probably did happen. More spade work here in the garden. We can see now that it's young Bobby doing it. And then we cut to, well, when is this? It's 1985? 1986? I've definitely written this down. Surely I wrote down when Live Aid happens. Yeah, 1985. So we can assume that this shot in the Falklands happens probably around May 1982. This is happening in July 1985 because they're watching Live Aid on the telly. So we can be very clear about what this date is meant to be. This is after Bobby's back from the war, and and it's an optimistic little moment. Live Aid's on the telly. It says end. So we can see that behind Audrey's bum. So they're celebrating their pregnancy. They're getting all excited by it. They're watching Live Aid on the telly. Queen are going to be on later, and we all know how brilliant the Queen were at Live Aid. And annoyingly, they were quite good. But I'm kind of sick of it. Kind of just over it. Don't really want to keep being told that Queen are the best band in the world, because they're not. And certainly, Live Aid has got a very sort of complex and despite the rehabilitation of Queen as just being the legends of Live Aid, and the millions it did for charity, Live Aid had what was definitely at this point in history in the 90s thought to be a negative effect on the footprint of pop culture, because it stopped pop culture being brash and anarchic like the Invisibles and made pop suddenly feel very responsible for saving the world, which led to a lot of stupid pomposity from rock stars, of which has kind of died out, but it wove itself into the pop firmament, right? So now, like, pompous world-saving rock is just one of the genres of rock, whereas before Live Aid it wasn't. So now you have bands like Coldplay who don't go around saving people's lives, but kind of make music that sort of feels like they do, So there's definitely a complex and probably skewing negative effect that Live Aid has had on the pop firmament. Remember that the Invisibles really cares about that kind of thing as well. As much as it's trying to give you this touching story about the complexity of the depths of the darkness of a man's soul, it also wants you to know that Live Aid was lame, because it kind of has too pat an echo of positivity in this panel here. Also, I think there's a mistake, because it says end of part one. But Live Aid was broadcast on the BBC, so they don't have adverts, so they don't have ad breaks. Maybe you would get these. I don't know. I could have done a bit more research into this, to be honest. But maybe there were like split holding screens while they did all the jiggery pokery between the bands coming on and switching the broadcast between Philadelphia and London. Although the Philadelphia broadcast wouldn't have come online yet, because it would have been still 5 a.m. there. This is probably about 11 in the morning on what was it, the 20-something of July 1985. What have I written as a note there? Oh, okay. And then there's a little bit of a wiggle here in the storytelling. So we jump from this moment of Bobby and Audrey kind of getting excited about the birth of their soon-to-be child, which is kind of sweet, and that's nice, and we don't get much sweetness and niceness between them. And then it's almost like, right, and the next day he goes to the Armed Forces Career Centre and he goes and buys some fags. But this, obviously we can pin this very closely to like May of 1979. So this isn't happening. So he hasn't gone, right, I'm a family man now, I'm going to shape up and join the army. He's already in the army by this point, because he's left the army by this point, because this is 1982, this is 1986, this is probably 1970, this is 1979. So like Bobby has made the decision that leads him here before here. Although the way the narrative lays it out could make you think that he's shaping up because he's got a kid on the way, but he's not. And obviously the subtext here is Maggie's Tory election victory, and the Tories ruined your life. Like, the Tories ruin lives. They destroy. They're the death cult at the end of history, which we really need, touch wood, to get rid of quite soon. And the things happening in these billboard signs here and in these newspaper headlines, and in these assholes in the newsagents talking about how great it is that Maggie's got in, that's the thing that destroyed the world, and that's important. So, like, at the same time that like Bobby's innocence gets turned into militarism, gets kind of turned into that fag end of British imperialism and murder thing, it's spelled out quite well, and that architecture destroys Bobby's life in the way that it will. Here he is lying and recovering. Oh, they're going to give you it from his. This is after this. This would be in sort of late or mid 1982 still, while Bobby's recovering from his injuries. They're going to give you a medal. I'd rather I had a drink. Oh, sorry. I'd rather I had a drink. And then, and this is another one of the points where, a bit like with Stewie's motivation, I think the comic kind of, sort of sells out its kind of theme of like the complexity of small evils which make a man evil. Yeah. So this lovely, optimistic, hopeful baby that they're celebrating the first movements of here. Bobby finds out that their daughter, who's called Jess, has been born with cerebral palsy. Sorry. And the nurse goes, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," as if like, and along with all of the blows that have kind of like beaten Bobby down in his life, this is really sold to us as though the worst thing that can happen is having a child born with cerebral palsy. And, I just don't think that reflects reality terribly well. I think that most people, not most people, but okay, it's probably like most people who have a child who's got cerebral palsy and spend time parenting them, most people don't feel that this is like a terrible thing that's happened to them. What most people find is that it kind of unlocks reserves of strength and empathy and understanding that they didn't know they had. Now, maybe that's not possible if you've already had Bobby's history of difficulties and growing up in an abusive household and stuff. But the way that this is, for a comic which is trying to be so like having an open and honest conversation about the things that make us evil, for it basically presents the birth of a child with cerebral palsy as being like just one of the worst things that the world can do to you to make you, and it would make you evil. And no, I don't think so. I don't think it does. And to be fair, although I think this is a Stewie style kind of like weakness in the text, if you're very generous in your reading of the following panel, where Bobby's mum, Ina, kind of reveals to Bobby the monster of Stewie dressed up in a gas mask as being just a gas mask. In a way, Ina's saying, your daughter isn't a monster, she's Jess and she's lovely. It's not a monster, it's just a gas mask. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm doing quite a lot of work to give the comic that reading, but also I think maybe it is there. I just don't think it's terribly clear. I think that this isn't a great portrayal of what it's like to be the parent of a disabled child. More Stewie being grim, but the subtext here is like things that look like monsters aren't, and the comic knows that, but I don't think it communicates it very well. Obviously, we recognise the mask, right? We're beginning to know, like, beyond the mask as being a symbol of the hangover of war, which is creating these traumatic circumstances that these people grew up in. The kind of it makes clear the subtext of like Bobby's parents having been victims of war themselves and carrying that violence forward into Bobby and Stewie's childhood, as we've seen. That's why that's one of the reasons why Bobby's dad might be violent himself, right? Like, Bobby's dad isn't the beginning of the chain of violence. Yeah, that's what the mask is doing. This is page 13, by the way. Over on page 14, we see the further effect that militarization is having on Bobby as he is on the boat with his buddies. They're singing "We're on the march with Maggie's army." I didn't look up what how the song goes. I should have, rather than trying to just make up a tune on the spot, I should have looked up what the actual tune of this song is. We're on the road to Argentine. It's not a road, it's a sea, but like, they don't care. So this is him, this is him on a boat with his mates, singing, drinking, on their way to the Falklands, where, you know, he will have this kind of pivotal wounding moment. So what do you reckon? What do you reckon, Archie? You think we'll actually see any fighting? No chance. The Argies are going to take one look at us and run like fuck. Nobody's going to take on the British Army, mate. Nobody in their right mind. This will be over in a day. It wasn't over in a day. It wasn't like a long, drawn-out war, but yeah, it was more serious, as I've said, than we think. Flashback to Bobby at school. What about you, Bobby? What are you going to be when you grow up? A spaceman, Miss Pollitt, yeah? So we can assume, I think, from that, and this looks to be happening a little, like a couple of years, not too long after the fireworks. Either this is happening in 1969 when we touched down on the moon. That would explain the presence of the moon kind of hovering around Bobby's head on his little mobile back when he was a baby on his first, or is it second? Probably second birthday. Just second from the development. And obviously, like, from a storytelling point of view, it would be Bobby's first birthday. I don't know, maybe, let's say it's his first birthday. We can say that that's probably happening in 1969, or Bonfire Night was happening in 1969. This is probably a few years after, and we know that Bobby's ambition is to be a spaceman, which is kind of like a very, literally a very high-flown, lofty ambition. Doesn't accord with the reality, which is him being hauled out of the mud by his mates in the Falklands. We finally learn what, and it's juxtaposed obviously with this moment of wounding here. We finally learn what he's been digging the grave for, and it is Brandy, his dog friend that he had growing up through his childhood. Bobby looks, it's a kind of maybe it's a shame with the colouring that Bobby is wearing kind of roughly a similar outfit to he's wearing here when he looks to be in his late teens. He looks younger here, like in his kind of early teens, although he's wearing pretty much the same clothes, so it's difficult to know exactly when this moment of Brandy's dying happens. But yeah, dogs don't live that long, do they? And he's definitely around when Bobby is quite young, like still young enough to be in bunk beds kind of thing. So, maybe Brandy just lived for a long time. Obviously, Brandy's around when they're on the mound at the beginning. If we kind of take this as being if we take that first image as being like a transposition of the famous Fool card tarot imagery, then the dog represents the kind of the impulsiveness of nature and the nature of impulsiveness. And Bobby loses that symbol of that. He buries that part of his being in the ground when he's being hauled out of the mud. Well, both when he literally does it and when he's being hauled out of the mud by his buddies. Over onto the next page, 15. Bobby is in the pub talking to Archie about getting a job. Quite a significant job, as it will turn out. Bobby's saying, that's a weird place. What is it they're getting up to in there? I've left the Scottish accent for now. Did you see all those wee guys just sitting like zombies? Are they brainwashing them or something? Is that not against the law? Ask no questions, Bobby. That's what I say. It's good money. Anyway, would you rather see these little bastards? I can't say the word bastards in like my own accent, apparently. Out there mugging old women and causing trouble. I suppose it just gave me the creeps. They're desperate for ex-soldiers like us. I'm quoting this passage at length for a reason. These private security firms are the wave of the future. All the big businesses are hiring their own security. The pay's good, and we're answerable to nobody but the man with the checkbook. Now, Archie is giving away a lot here about stuff. Before we get to that, I just want to point out a few of the details in this pub scene here. The Seabrook crisps, very. I think Seabrook crisps are still going. I just don't see them very often. You did see them a lot in the early 90s when this is set. And furthermore than saying that this is a very familiar pub crisp, like you wouldn't see them in shops, but you would see them in pubs. Further than that, I'm going to say, and Phil, and I could be totally wrong here, but I'm going to say that you don't just see them in pubs, but you see them in bars, like you see them more often than you would see them in pubs. You would see them in bars in non-pub spaces, non-pub contexts, right? So I'm talking about leisure centres, I'm talking about football clubs, rugby clubs, working men's clubs, union clubs, like working class spaces that aren't like British Legions, probably, rather than actual pubs. So I don't think that Bobby and Archie are talking in just like a pub here. I think that the all male nature of the space. I think this is like a bar on an army base, or like I say, a British Legion somewhere. It's not like a pub. It's a bar. It's like a veterans bar, but not not a pub. Brilliant. Somebody just stubbed the fag out on the side of the ashtray. The ashtray's empty, but there's fags on the side of it. Great little just like incidental detail from Steve Parkhouse here. There's also some spilt beer. This kind of they're eating crisps because they need to soak up a little bit. I think, you know, this isn't the first pint by any means, and you know the dog's called Brandy. Alcohol and you know, that's the first thing that he asks for when he wakes up out of his booze. We know that his dad used to come home drunk, beating his mum. Like the role that alcohol plays as an enabler and kind of booster of these patterns of violence is clear, you know, although implicit. Right. What Archie says here about private security firms being the wave of the future, he's absolutely right. And this is really interesting, just kind of tendency within capitalist cultures, is that basically when you automate production out of labour and into, well, automation, into, you know, robots, into factory processes, into technology, so you've got 10 people building a car, you bring in a load of robots to help. Suddenly you've got one guy building the car and one guy being the foreman, whose role is basically to discipline, to provide security for the one guy who's left. Yeah, you see this in your supermarket. You've got 10 checkouts where you buy your food. The next time you go in there, there's 2 checkouts and a load of automated checkouts, yeah, and a security guard. So what they've done is they've saved money on 10 jobs and replaced it with the money for one job, and that job is a security function. That's to stop, you know, in the supermarket example, that's to stop people from nicking the stuff because there's nobody there to sort of supervise them as they're taking the goods through. In the factory context, it's to make sure that they're not that they're not stealing from the company by not working constantly, by like slacking off basically, or stealing the materials there, or misusing them. This is a tendency within capital. You automate or you know, technologize processes, and you lose jobs, but you have to buy in security jobs to compensate for the fact that you've got more kind of like fixed wealth there. You've got expensive robots, and you've got somebody who could use that robot themselves or nick it if you don't specifically employ someone whose role is to stop them from doing that, right? So as capital advances, it sheds productive labour and brings in security. It brings in a disciplinary and violent function. This is basically Marx via Foucault, basically. And also you're like your Italian autonomous theorists, right? As they kind of learnt when the Fiat factories were being remodeled in the late 70s. So that's kind of like, and we see this happening right now. Like next time you like notice that happening in your supermarket, next time you go in there and a load of checkouts are replaced with, the self-scan things. Obviously, the other thing that's happening in there, not directly relevant to what Archie's saying, but the other thing is that the labour of scanning those items is being outsourced to you, the consumer. So that saving, that money that the company would have spent on paying the wages of that person to scan that stuff, now you're doing the work and you're not getting paid for it. Okay. So that's and this is something which this is just kind of inherent to capitalist production, basically. Archie's smart to know it, and he's right to identify it as the wave of the future because it's a tendency which is only gathering pace as more and more jobs are automated. Now that those jobs are kind of intellectual labour jobs as much as they are physical labour jobs, what you see is that security role is basically outsourced to, the people who are moderating Facebook posts, yeah? So, like, Facebook's got all of this productive technology, which you as the consumer of it can use, but also you can use it in ways which Facebook don't want you to use it by, sending a abusive posts or, they don't really care about that. Basically, they don't want you slagging off, they don't want you presenting an alternative model of life than the one that Facebook wants you to see. They take down videos of people protesting, and they take down videos of people murdering people and stuff, and they outsource the job of being a supervisor, of doing the security role, to people working in those moderator farms in wherever it might be. And these people, they have much worse working conditions than the people who directly work for Facebook, when what they do is basically clean up all the dirt that a system like Facebook creates via the way that it's used by its users. So all of the child porn, all of the snuff movies, all of the footage of people getting beaten by cops, all of just like the random abuse and bullying, all of that has to get filtered out by people performing the security role that Archie is talking about. So it's not. So when they say security, it doesn't have to be literally people running around with guns down corridors, like we'll see in a minute. It can also just mean people in a call center somewhere, not a call center, in a computer room somewhere, watching these videos, going, "Yeah, that's evil. Take it down." The burnout rates and the trauma of working in these things and the lack of compensation they have for it is another one of the scandals lurking inside the way that these technologies and the way that they are produced and used have. Yeah? Am I making sense? Also, what Archie's saying, although he's absolutely right to identify it as the wave of the future, it's also the wave of the past. Now, I don't want to go into this too much, but so we're talking about the Invisibles, which, as we've established many times, is a gloss for the Illuminati, which basically comes from the Illuminati as we understand it. The reason that they kind of have all of this Venice Biennale imagery is because they basically came out of Venice in like the 15th century as a squad of black magicians. Yeah, and these black magicians basically did work for people who were basically running private armies. So the kind of the big families who controlled these North Italian city-states were, they were nobles and they were kings and stuff. Basically, their trade was running private armies, and they would use their private armies to secure their own territory and extract the rents from the land that they controlled, but also they would hire out their armies to, in a kind of a very kind of complex web of violent power relations to, they'd form alliances and they'd lend their army to other city-states to help them secure land in return for a bit of help over here. Then they double-cross each other. All of that Borgia stuff, all of that, Renaissance proto-mafia stuff is built around private security firms. So the Illuminati's original job, their original business, was these private security firms, and they take and now that is a process that they've made inherent to the system of control that they have around the world, right? Okay, that's what the theory is. That's what you need to know about why Archie's saying this at this point in the comic. How's Audrey? I haven't seen her for a while. Bash. Oh yeah, she's all right, mate. So we're led to believe that by the juxtaposition of panels here, obviously Bobby's still a piece of shit. He's still beating Audrey. He probably did it just before he left because Archie's asking how she is. There's a flashback to him hitting her, and then he's wearing the same clothes as he's got on now, pretty much. So how's Audrey? Fine, she's fine. Fine, she's fine. She's not fine. Over on the next page, we see the results of that conversation that they had, Archie and Bobby working together, and this is when things start to fall into place. This is when things start to click. So you can tell here that the job they're talking about, it's teed up in the conversation that they're having here, but they're basically talking about Harmony House, where Dane was being kept with his mate Gaz in issue 1. These are the dudes who run to confront King Mob when he's busting Dane out of there, and all of a sudden, this kind of the scope and the, because so far you've been reading this comic going, why are you reading this comic? What's it got to do with the Invisibles? Suddenly and actually it's kind of cool. It's kind of audacious, the way that they've gone behind the curtain, if you like, and taken this kind of minor character and given him his consciousness. If you've read the comic, I'm not like that's the point, right? Like that's what this kind of issue's big thing is. It was a kind of a thing at the time, right? It's the same kind of like 90s thought of like, hey man, the other big example of it is in Clerks, like Kevin Smith's first movie, where one of the characters is talking about like the innocent contractors who were helping to build the second Death Star, and how they were there working away. Oh, they're just doing a job, I build super lasers, don't blame me. And then the rebels turn up and they blow up the Death Star. Suddenly all of those innocent dudes who were there just building a super laser, who's going to feed their families all of a sudden now that these bloody rebels have come along and destroyed the innocent men who were working on the working to build the Death Star. So the answer to that is, well, they kind of like, unfortunately, you're not innocent if you're building those things. You are a contributing factor, and therefore you're a legitimate target within the rules of engagement of presumably what the Invisibles and the Rebel Alliance and Star Wars kind of operate under. And also robot labour. It's Star Wars, robot labour, Kevin Smith. It's just robots, don't worry about it. The humanity or otherwise of robots was in the Star Wars universe. That's a different podcast. But that's the big like trick here, is to go, and there are kind of, there are ethical and moral problems with it to go, well, what about this evil guy? What's made him evil? Who are you to say that he's evil and that his choices wouldn't be made by you if you were in exactly the same circumstance? So, there's a lot that you can kind of chew on there, and there's a lot to agree with and disagree with, and it's, it's interesting, and it's provocative storytelling. And whereas you may not agree with where Morrison kind of lands, although he's quite careful not to land anywhere too firmly, you can definitely you've got to respect the kind of the fact that he's gone into what is a fairly difficult space to go in. The question of like what's going on in the mind of that stormtrooper that Luke Skywalker's just killed is a good one to have. And in fact, it's the whole basis of like one of the main characters in the Star Wars universe now in the new films, right? Is the stormtrooper who took his helmet off and was revealed to be just a person, man, like you and me. And there's another interesting detail happening in this page 2. Actually, there's 2. So first of all, you have we're on page 16, by the way. You have Bobby saying the alarm's gone off 5 times tonight. The bloody alarm. Oh no, sorry, I got the accent wrong again. The alarm's gone off 5 times tonight. One of the orderlies who comes to take away Dane at this exact moment in Harmony House. He's complaining about the alarm having gone off too much. So there's a nice little bit of, keeping control of things in the script. But furthermore, Archie says, while they're chatting and putting on their gear for for a night of patrolling a brainwashing factory, did you see Baywatch last night? What a woman! What a woman, eh? Did you see that Baywatch last night? What a woman, eh? He's probably talking about Pamela Anderson, right? She was the star of Baywatch at the time. I think people maybe forget how absurdly famous she was as well. She was super famous. It was basically her and Princess Di were probably the most famous women on the planet for a period there. We know that Princess Di is relevant to our story. Pamela. Okay, one thing you've always got to remember, right? We know that always remember what a massive Robert Anton Wilson fanboy Grant Morrison is. Yeah. So the sort of deification of Pamela Anderson fits very well with Wilson's theories of post-Jungian interpretations of the embodiment of archetypal forces, right? Robert Anton Wilson wrote a whole book about it called Ishtar Rising, which was about although he kind of used, I think he kind of basically used Marilyn Monroe, who was kind of the Pamela Anderson, obviously, of a few decades previous. Although he used Marilyn Monroe as his example of a woman kind of consciously embodying the attributes of the divine feminine archetype. Although I don't know if divine feminine is necessarily the right word. I think it's maybe the divine sexiness archetype. By embodying that, the individual is able to recreate themselves as a person of their choosing, embody these kind of primal cosmic, psycho-cosmic forces, and you get a lot of power from it, right? It works. If you can do it well, and consciously, I think is the thing. If you can do it deliberately, then the power of the archetype flows through you, and you become somewhat, you become iconic, like Marilyn Monroe or like Pamela Anderson, right? I think Wilson writes about Pamela Anderson. I think he kind of definitely slotted her into this scheme and said, look, it's happening again. The thing I wrote about years ago, it's here in this woman as well. And if he's not, then Morrison is definitely thinking that. He's definitely kind of thinking about the way that Pamela Anderson embodies blonde bombshell sexuality. And I think it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure the thing is, right, if you rinse those archetypes too much, if you do this tactic, and don't get me wrong, Marilyn Monroe is a really smart woman, really well read, and a Jungian, and I think exactly the same can be said for Pamela Anderson as well. I think she's really smart. I think she knows what she's doing. I think she knows her Jung. I think she's very aware that she reinvented herself in this kind of mold, and it made her the most famous woman on the planet, made her wealthy and powerful. But I think there's also maybe, in Jung's career himself, he kind of shit himself a bit towards the end of his life, towards the end of his in the late 30s, he shit himself a bit by writing this wonderful he was basically wrote this. What was it called? I think I might even have it here somewhere. It's in Essays on Contemporary Events, Reflections on Nazi Germany. I think it's okay. It's called Wotan, right? He talks about how Hitler and the Nazi Party deliberately, in the same way that Marilyn would later activate the divine feminine or divine sexiness archetype, the Nazis and Hitler consciously activated the Wotan archetype. Yeah, the wild hunt, the rampaging, irresistible force of the European forest. Yeah. And the pre-Christian war gods of Europe, right? And I think that if you take these examples, I think two things become apparent. One is that you can definitely do it, and by tapping into these archetypal powers, other people respond very like clearly to it, and passionately and powerfully, and it works, right? You can do amazing things if you successfully tap into these archetypes and embody them and live them out. Other people will facilitate it. You can turn 20s Weimar Germany into the Nazi war machine within 10 years, right? You can do incredible things. You could make yourself from a kind of a struggling actress into the most powerful woman in the world. But the second thing is that the power kind of exhausts itself and kind of goes unstable quite quickly and inevitably. So there's obviously like a risk in this strategy. So arguably the same kind of rampaging like blitzkrieg force of the Wehrmacht, and its kind of embodiment of that value system and that kind of like approach, meant that when it slammed into the brick wall of like the Russian winter, it couldn't do anything. It was all over, right? It was over. When in 1943 or whenever it was, when Pamela Anderson had been kind of like the object of lust for millions of men for several years, I think you could make a case. I don't want to sound like some kind of like concerned parent or whatever, but I think you can make a case that like she kind of opened the door to a culture of like porn everywhere. And I reckon that teenage boys these days, I haven't got any evidence of this, but I reckon that teenage boys these days probably watch a bit too much porn, and it maybe gives them some weird ideas about sex and how to relate to women or how to relate to their sexual partners. And I'm not blaming Pamela Anderson for that, but I think maybe she kicked a door open, which kind of begat a historical process which has brought us to where we are, which is maybe a little bit too sexy, maybe a little bit too Baywatch in the way that we think about sexiness. Yeah. And it's only a throwaway line, but like, that Morrison's thinking about this kind of thing. And actually, it's not relevant whether Morrison's thinking about this kind of thing. It's in the comic. He refers to Pamela Anderson. And obviously, as we've seen by now, every single detail in this comic is being written and drawn down to the the finest detail. I would also say, and also Pamela Anderson is kind of an invisible, right? I mean, beyond the magic and witchcraft thing, which I was just sort of talking about, there are really scurrilous rumor sites, which maybe I shouldn't even look at. Never mind, kind of nearly believe. But her relationship with Julian Assange, the kind of her reinvention in the 21st century, in this decade of the 21st century, as like the high priestess of the cyber wars of the global info power struggle, is quite weird, isn't it? Like I say, there are kind of gossip stroke conspiracy websites about kind of her role in this whole Julian Assange thing. Like maybe she's like a courier. Yeah, maybe she's like carrying messages to and fro from him to whoever. That's all a bit weird. Like it is, isn't it? The whole Julian Assange thing is quite weird and bad. Like whatever you may think of how like sort of lame the guy's hair is. He's being treated really badly. And he does for being a whistleblower, basically. He's being stamped on by repressive Western governments, and they're trampling over their own principles of justice in order to get him in a way which is really not okay, regardless of whether he may or may not be goody invisible or like a kind of an agent of some weird far right cult or whatever. I don't know. So that's weird too, right? Pamela Anderson's invisible. Okay, we can agree that. Then we have this detail where he's going through his Bobby's going through his dinner, and he finds this note which we see says, "Sorry about this morning, Bobby. Love you, Ord." And that's kind of heartbreaking because she still loves him, and he's, you can just tell by the look on his face here that he's kind of broken and sick with guilt. Yeah, as he should be. But like, yeah, that look on his face there, as he sort of reflects on like how little he deserves the love of his wife, is, it's down, it's heavy, and it's sad, and it's brilliantly drawn. But they, they've got their familiar outfits on. They've got their wooden stocked, I can't remember what they were, like modified M16s, because as I said at the time, these are not your usual security guards in a Borstal, are they? Obviously, like they've got assault rifles. It's almost like they're expecting an attack from a crazed assassin in a weird mask. Over on the next page, we've got an advert for the Jerky Boys. I don't know if you remember the Jerky Boys. They did phone pranks, and they. I guess they had an MTV show. This is like an advert for what looks like the video that's being put out by MTV. You've read the book, heard the album, seen the movie, now buy the home video. They were a comedy sensation. They were basically they just did prank calls and got really, well, not famous, because part of the point was that they would hide themselves or be invisible. Hoaxsters is what they are, which is kind of a super Discordian, super Illuminati-y thing to be. Yeah, I remember them making me laugh. Because prank videos are puerile and funny. Prank phone calls are rather, and then there's this cool picture in the bottom, which is, I'm not even sure what it is. What is it? MTV Video Musicals. I think it's like a video of the performances at the MTV Music Awards 1995 show. But it's got this super Illuminati iconography in it. Don't know if you can see, but it's got like an octopus with a pentagram with an eye at its center. The arms are holding on to these astronauts. We've just, obviously, Bobby told us a few minutes ago that his ambition is to be a spaceman. Remember? Yeah, it's like astronauts and octopuses and eye in the pentagrams, and it's kind of creepy. But also very on brand for the Invisibles, so that's good. Over on the next page, we have what is a very clear flashback now. We know where we are now, into to the scene immediately prior to all of these dudes getting running into King Mob. Right here, we see horrible old Mr. Gelt again. But yeah, this page is kind of simple. It just kind of for the slow ones at the back, it tells you what's going on here finally, and it finally clicks into place. On the following page, we have another kind of horrible sort of kitchen sink domestic abuse moment where Jess is kind of witnessing Bobby abusing Ord again, and it's a horrible scene, really nasty. I didn't want this life. Do you think I wanted this life? And she's bleeding and screaming and telling her to stop hitting him. And he has this kind of moment of guilt and kind of gives in and begs Jess for forgiveness. And there's a key line here of, so it's in the first panel on this page, he says, "I didn't want this life. Do you think I wanted this fucking life?" And then on the final panel, he says, "I don't want to be like this. I'm not a bad man." And it's like, well, it's like, yeah, nobody thinks they're a bad man. It's the whole Brotherhood of Evil Mutants problem, isn't it? But he is, and he's going to get shot in a minute. And that's, violence doesn't solve everything. So there's no real pleasure to be taken from his being shot by a super cool, Britpop assassin. But yeah, it happens in the story. But what we do get on this page, and for a little bit, we to really hammer home the tragedy of this now, and to give us a bit more view of Audrey. That's what the next few pages do, and we see the moment that they first meet, which is she's working in a burger van, and he's a punk, after a gig at the 100 Club or something, and this is probably shortly after he moved to London and got his hair cut. I think we have to assume that, she smiles at him, he smiles at her, and they obviously they fancy each other, and they get together, and it's kind of sweet, right? He's a very sort of on brand, and this must be, I guess it could be as late as 79, but yeah, but it's quite like he's like, this is like a goth punk, which apart from Susie Sue, there were literally only a handful of women in the entire world who looked like that in like 77. By 79, or in 76, 77, when this could have been, but by 79 there would have been lots more. He's wearing slightly gauche, like Kings Road knockoff style punk with all of the excessive safety pinnery here, and his hair is like 79 punk rather than 76, 77 punk. So it's quite difficult to place in time. This is page 18, by the way, we're on now. But of course he's a punk, right? Of course he's a punk. So we know that he's embittered and kind of carrying some violence around, sort of both within and without him, right? But it's more than that. What am I trying to say? Okay, so basically, punk as a movement, and specifically this form of punk before it kind of went back over to America and kind of formed into like quite a sort of a useful radical subculture. This London 79, say, iteration of punk is it has a really weird relationship with the concept of innocence, which is obviously the whole thing that this episode is about the slow loss of Bobby's innocence. Like, punks don't trust anything, or like this type of punk doesn't trust anything more complicated than the sound that a baby makes, right? So like the whole point of punk is this massive reification of innocence and youth and simplicity and of kind of unadornment in cultural artifacts. So simple rock and roll music, 3 chords. Kind of like a bit of a fetish for a kind of a purity. And I know that given that they're all kind of grubby and aggressive, like purity and innocence seems not quite right. But like a punk mosh pit is like a kind of a celebration of non-aggressive violence, such as you get in a kid's playground, right? Punks have a bit of a thing for innocence and simplicity, and they distrust anything which smacks of adult over-complexification of the world and things in the world. So of course, Bobby Murray is a punk, and punk is like the kind of the, like, there is, okay, so obviously this is like if we think of the Invisibles as being like a product of the Britpop era, and it goes to more interesting places than just Blur versus Oasis or whatever, but we've talked about this before, obviously. Like, Britpop takes just as much. So flashing back to page 9, when Bobby punches Stewie and shoves his teddy bear in the bin, Britpop owes just as much, or more even, musically and kind of aesthetically, to this early 70s period of convivial pop. Like, the Kinks were really good at this point, basically, when and the glam bands were pop in a way that English guitar music wouldn't be again until Britpop. Britpop probably owes more to this than it does to its much vaunted swinging 60s London vibe, and definitely more than the punk vibe that's alluded to here. So, like, So like Britpop was just a postmodern, magpieing of that 60s moment, that 70s moment, and that late 70s punk moment. But the punk one is probably the shallowest and least relevant. Like, do you know what I mean? Like apart from like the kind of the fact that the guitars are turned up louder, there's not much that Britpop nicked from punk, and like attitude really, and heritage. Like the Britpop bands claimed to be as aggressive and up for it as the punk bands did, but they weren't. They were much more conservative. And that's the thing. But we do get a nice. We like this. What's interesting is this early mid-70s moment, which doesn't get written into the history of pop music, because we're only supposed to sort of think of like Bowie or whatever at the time. But actually, there was a very sort of vibrant working class local like party scene spread out all over the UK, right? Finally, by about 72, people in the suburbs, or not even the suburbs, but people in the shires could get weed and could get acid. It's around here when the long 60s, the tail end of the long 60s, the good times actually happened in Britain. And the swinging 60s thing was basically a very small, short-lived, localised London phenomenon. So what I'm saying is I like this page 9 stuff. I like the haircuts and the outfits, and they should be noted. Where are we? Back on page 19. So we know when this is. This is 1969. Bobby's in his school uniform. Yeah, okay, right. So yeah, when he said a minute ago to his teacher, I want to be a spaceman when I grow up, that probably was about 1969, and he was saying that because there was all the moon landing stuff at the time. So this is So this is happening almost, within a couple of months of exactly 50 years ago. 1969. November when was it? When was the moon landing? I'm an idiot for not knowing that. I'm really sorry for not knowing when the moon landing was. I think it's July. July? I'm an idiot for not knowing when that was. Bobby grabs his brother's sharp stick. He becomes Stewie in a way and charges into the coal shed to uncover the mystery of the mask monster. Which has been lurking in the shed like this kind of monster that all children know of, that lurks under their bed. For Bobby, it's in the coal shed, and it's a gas mask on a hook. And then we see the thing is that he challenges the gas mask monster to reveal itself as not being real, and then 30 years later, whether through this act of challenge or by mere coincidence, he comes face to face with the gas mask monster this time, and it does kill him. Yeah, like this monster that he was scared of throughout his childhood was real and came and got him. Which is terrifying. It's terrifying actually to think that like the monsters of the future lie in wait for us like that, and see time in a different way. Bobby's very frightened, and his mates are swearing, and they're all getting shot. My balls, and time slows down as Bobby's final moment arrives, courtesy of King Mob's handgun. I love the way that Steve Parkhouse draws King Mob's classic era war mask and fetish jacket vibes here. He makes him look like a hairy spaceman in a hairy scuba diving spaceman, and it's absolutely brilliant. Such a good shot of King Mob's mask here. Makes him look kind of ridiculous and terrifying in a way which Steve Yeowell and all the other people who end up drawing it throughout the course of the series, which isn't many actually, he gets the ridiculous and the sublimely terrifying really well here. Steve Parkhouse is a legend. Have I said yet that he did Big Dave? We know we've had a couple of references to Big Dave in the previous issues. The bad guy, like one of the muggers, is wearing a Big Dave stamp on his coat on the first page of issue 10, yeah, the voodoo one. Steve Parkhouse was the guy who drew Big Dave for Grant Morrison and Mark Millar in 2000 AD. And I've talked about that. We've talked about that before. But Steve Parker, and obviously he's very famous for. He's not very famous. He's comic book famous for having done the Jeffries saga with Alan Moore, the Milkman murders with. Who wrote those? Would that be Kelly? Would that be one of those? One of those American noughties guys. Steve Parkhouse is brilliant. He's an absolute revelation in this issue. Okay, and then onto the page, and we're flashing, and because Bobby's moment has arrived, we're flashing back to what is, I think, probably his happiest moment. And it turns out that his happiest moment was going on holiday with Audrey, where he proposed to her. A fair amount going on here. I have been unable to identify what that silhouette is. Obviously, we've got a moon here. Remember, this is a full moon, though, not a horned, scary moon. This is like a kind of a benevolent bathing moon. And a romantic moon. I don't know where this lighthouse is. I've been looking at outlines of lighthouses, presumably in Scotland. I've looked at loads of them, and none of them have this silhouette. So it's possibly just one that Steve Parkhouse has made up rather than a real one. But it's quite unusual, right? Like lighthouses don't stack like that, although you kind of think they do. If you actually look at what most lighthouses look like, they don't have this 1, 2, 3 tier structure. They basically have sort of 1 or 2, basically. So I thought it would be unusual enough to be able to find, and it's not. If you know which, don't. Bobby's, they're talking, they're being romantic, they're sharing a bag of chips. I guess it could be in the south, it could be in London. Because they meet in London. I don't know. For some reason, I just think this is Scotland, but it might not be. It might be. It could be. It could be the Sussex Downs. It could be the Sussex coast. It could be really near to where I am. It could be the south coast. Could be the Norfolk coast. But I still haven't found the. I don't know where it is, and I haven't found the lighthouse that is here on this promontory that they're walking along. Bobby says, when I was out playing, my dad would always say I had to come in when it got dark. I'm not doing the accent anymore. I had to come in when it got dark, or the hairy trombone would get me. The hairy trombone lived in the coal cellar. It was the scariest thing in the world. And Audrey says, the hairy trombone? That sounds a bit disgusting. Bobby goes on, I used to be really scared of that door. It was blue and all the paint was kind of peeling off. I remember one, and there's lots of, this is very sort of authentic sounding stuff, isn't it? Like, this is very the thing that you're scared of when you're a kid. You do, like, it's the details of the peeling paint which stick with you. Remember that, like, the Invisibles is quite interested in surfaces and how they may or may not, how they may kind of hide or enhance the reality of the object or concept underneath it, right? So the writing of the paint of the writing of the word Barbalith on the wall of the subway station when Dane has his initiation, that paint is wet, yeah. And peeling paint is like a kind of a sort of a bit of a metaphor for like trans-dimensional movement, which trust me, it is in the Invisibles. When I remember one day when I was about 9, so this is all quite helpful. We know that it happened as the moon landing was happening, or it kind of feels like it did. So Bobby's born in 1960, so he's like 35 by the time he dies. I remember one night when I was about 9, I decided to go out and fight it. I knew I had to. I opened the door and I saw the scariest thing in the world, and it was just a gas mask, an old gas mask hanging up on a nail above the coal. So, and this is the hairy, and he's, and the name that he had for this was the hairy trombone. Now, I'm aware, as I go into this one, that I'm going to sound a little bit mad, but the hair trombone, rather than hairy trombone, is a line in Kipling, what's it called? It's called the parade song of the camp animals, and it's one of Kipling's kind of awful bits of British imperial propaganda, right? Where he makes basically, the violent suppression of the Indian subcontinent into a jaunty into a jaunty poem for kids with animals having fun as they carry guns to go and blow up brown people in India. And we have, so you have the horses, the elephants, the bullocks, who kind of are all the pack animals of the armed column, right? This is all pre the motor car, obviously, or early motor car, when animals still did a lot of the work in war. And the hairy trombone, or the hair trombone, is how Kipling describes the necks of the camels. Yeah, because they have kind of bendy necks, a camel, don't they? I think we're probably talking about single hump camels. What are they called? Pachyderms. And that kind of curvy loop is a bit like the curvy loop of a trombone, but it's hairy. So I know this is a reach, but even when he was only a boy, terrified of the thing in the coal shed, it was named for the imperial militaristic nightmare that he was growing up in, unaware of, and that would, put him on the front line of this new conflict with the Invisibles, or this conflict with the Invisibles that would lead to his death. Right. So like the traces and the stamps and the stain of Britain's imperial legacy was wrapped up inside Bobby's nightmares without him even knowing right from the beginning. And they have a kind of and then it gets very Britpop. Do you ever wonder how you'll die? No, I'm gonna live forever. Baby, don't really want to know. Right? It gets very Oasis. It's super romantic. And they have like a nice moment. Suddenly, the balloon of Bobby's ambitions and hopes and dreams that we saw him throw into the gunpowder, into the explosives when he was a boy, reappears as this three-dimensional, super bright and beautiful, large, adult size hot air balloon that they watch from below and say, "Isn't that brilliant? I wish we were up there." And he proposes to her and they kiss, and it's sweet. Audrey looks a lot like Bobby's mum here with her short blonde crop, and she looks great. And what this must be again. This must be. I don't know when this is. It's got to be early 80s, right? It's got to be before Bobby signs up for the army. It's got to be before the Falklands, obviously. But yeah, so maybe I think maybe the art on Bobby when he's a punk isn't terribly accurate. And although he looks like a 1979 punk, it's probably happening in 1977. There weren't many punks outside of London, but Bobby was in London, so he could have been a punk. But I think, and then this moment here, this could be 79, 80, 81. But Bobby's hair has changed a lot, and so has Audrey's. Will he let me marry you? Anytime. He proposes, they kiss. It goes, the sun goes down. It's lovely. Oh, okay. Then there's another advert. Live from the House of Blues, presented by Pontiac Sunfire. I don't know what Pontiac Sunfire is. Wall-to-wall, rock, jazz, blues, pop, country, and then a list of bands. It's a TV show that does live performances of rock, jazz, blues, pop, country bands, such as the Allman Brothers, Joe Jackson, Sheryl Crow, Dave Matthews Band, the Spin Doctors, Hootie and the Blowfish. They might be giant, like a load of bands. John Lee Hooker and Tom Jones. Tom Jones! I've never seen this program, obviously, because it was an American TV show. The word Pontiac Sunfire is like a stupid superhero name, which I quite like. This is an entirely irrelevant advert. The House of Blues. I mean, we've come from this very blue spread here on pages 21 and 22. If you turn over the page and there's a black and yellow and red advert that says House of Blues. So maybe there's some kind of, and obviously when a House of Blues is a sad thing. You could describe Bobby's life as a House of Blues, I suppose, if you wanted to. But I think this is an eminently unimportant advert. And really all it's doing is punctuating our journey to add a bit more weight when we get to this page here, which is King Mob's bullet hitting Bobby in the face, smashing his helmet. And he says he's the one in issue 1 going, oh fuck, I can't see, what's he done to my face? Is it bad? Fuck, this isn't happening. Oh, I'm dying. Oh fuck, I think I'm. And King Mob answers his question. This isn't happening. With yes, it is happening. Remember, there's the cool smoke effect on the gun, on the barrel of King Mob's gun, and he executes him. And all of a sudden, it does seem. See, this is the cool thing, right? Even though Morrison sort of plays a trick here of being like, no, but he was a good guy once, and he lived, and he was real, and it was nice. And then pause for the crap advert. And then over onto page 23, page 23. He dies and it's horrible. Even though we know that Bobby is a complex and human, we don't really, we could easily not be mourning his passing, and yet the way that it's shown to us here is shocking and horrible. And you do feel bad for him. And also, we won't be able to think about King Mob's particular brand of, wires, cracks, and guns in quite the same way again, right? Because we know the consequences of it now. And that's it. That's pretty much the issue. We're onto the final page, and of course, all of this has been happening within the context of Bobby playing Dead Man Fall and running into the imaginary gunfire that his friends are firing at him. That was quite good, Bobby. What do you mean quite good? That was dead realistic. That was like in a war film. I bet I could be an actor. Right, it's Finley's turn. Then we have our captions reappear. It's only a game. Okay. Do you want a knife, a grenade, or a rifle? Try to remember. And innocent Bobby, is dead. He's dead here. He's dead there. And that's the end of what is. Let's be honest. I mean, some people it's their favourite issue of the Invisibles. Other people have a problem with it because it makes you feel too sympathetic for this asshole, which I have some sympathy for as a reading. But the kind of the ambition and the scope of what Morrison's trying to do here. I think there are plenty of moral reasons not to humanize bad people. Okay, you can make the argument that if we just kind of say that someone's a monster, we forget the nuance, and we won't learn how to prevent more monsters from being born. Right. On the other hand, there's a usefulness in the clarity of the category of monster. And I think that's a very interesting set of grey areas amongst all of this black and white, certainly the black and white that I've just been talking about, to play with. Going into those grey areas is a worthwhile thing to do. However, the black and the white are real and useful too, right? Because the world may be infinitely complex to all intents and purposes, but that doesn't mean that our models of it that doesn't mean that our models of it and the stories that we tell about it have to be, right? In fact, the reason that we have models and stories is that they aren't as complex as the world, and you can use them to draw lines that separate this from this, black from white. I'm pointing at page 24, I guess. 22, 23, 24, yeah. To those of you listening in black and white. And that's the end of the issue. I mean, as I say, a lot of people, it's their favourite one. I wouldn't call it my favourite one, but I would say it's jolly impressive and takes us to a lot of important places, and there's something quite sweet about the way it wears its heart on its sleeve as well, right? The way that this comic really wants you to worry about the stormtroopers, and although I think that's a lesson that you can kind of overemphasize, it's definitely something worth thinking about. Definitely worth something worth having in your head. And Steve Parkhouse, I mean, Morrison says it here. Here endeth the first year of the Invisibles. So we're onto the letters page now. Invisible ink. Here this is the bit that I already read out to you at the start about what Dead Man Fall is. But before that, he says, "Here endeth the first year of the Invisibles, with the magnificent artwork of Steve Parkhouse to play us out and into the coming apocalypse." I agree. I think that Steve Parkhouse's work in this issue is magnificent. It's. Okay, on to the letters page. The first one is from Jesse W. Campbell in Taylors, South Carolina. He's got his full address here, and I'm not going to read it out because he might still live there. It seems to be this is like a free association kind of trippy one. This is a trippy one, a trippy letter. The egg, Mercurius, the water, the fire. I think in a way this letter that Jesse W. Campbell is writing to Dear Grant, the Invisible Ink column. I think actually he's writing this letter about an issue of Doom Patrol, really, because all of this kind of like alchemical stuff that he's talking about here hasn't really. I mean, although it's kind of there's a bit of like, although it's not too far away from what's in the Invisibles. He seems to be referencing stuff that Morrison writes about in the Doom Patrol more than in the Invisibles. It is the carte blanche, the white card. I understand, I am with you. I have come through the black heart and hold the mist grey spiral in my left hand. I don't know. Maybe this means something. Maybe this is specific to a particular school of esoteric initiation in South Carolina or, America. Or everywhere. I understand. I'm so glad. And Morrison's reply is, a bit winky and cryptic as well. I'm so glad I'm not the only one, Jesse. Yes, it is white. White is capitalized, isn't it? I think this is the white card. I think this is the white light of enlightenment. I don't really know what they're talking about here. They're talking in like nod, nod, wink, wink, special guide code, and that's fine. It's good that those kind of letters are popping up, and it's good that he answers them in the spirit that they're written. And then this letter. I'll be honest with you guys, this one's a tricky one. This next letter in the Invisible Ink letters column of Invisibles number 12 is from Nina Power from Wiltshire in England, right? And I read that and I was like, hang on, I know I don't know her personally, but the name Nina Power was familiar, and I thought, well, hang on, why is that? And then I remembered Nina Power is like a philosopher lecturer at Roehampton University, I think. She wrote a pretty well regarded kind of like a feminist book called The One-Dimensional Woman kind of like the first wave of like when Zero Books were publishing Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism and a few other titles. That was one of them. That was one of the and so this is about 2010, I guess. Maybe a bit earlier, maybe 2008, 2009, 2010, something like that. And she wrote this well-regarded sort of Marxist feminist book, little pamphlet-y kind of book, polemic-y thing, I guess. I haven't read it. I'm pretty sure I haven't read it. Called One-Dimensional Woman. She's a philosopher at Roehampton with what they call impeccable Marxist feminist credentials, and she wrote a letter when she was a kid. I mean, she's probably about my age, maybe a couple of years younger. She's either in her late 30s or early 40s, right? Basically, she might have been, I don't know, 15, 13, 12 years old when she wrote this. She's obviously bright as a button. Invisible Ink. The Invisibles being, and she wrote, okay. So I'm like, wow, Nina Power. Okay, so she was, around kind of the time of the Occupy movement in around 2010, and then, the student riots in the UK and protests against the introduction or the raising of tuition fees, which was again around 2010. Nina Power was a fairly visible figure involved in that. She's a good speaker, eloquent, ish, and she was involved in that, and she was a figure on the nascent online left in about 2010. And it struck me that although I was reasonably familiar with her blogging and stuff back then, I hadn't heard from her or heard of her for a long time. until I read her name in this issue of The Invisibles. Nina Power, you see. And she's written this. Her letter is it's kind of adorable. It's like a very bright, like you would say, say 14, 15, 16, whatever year old girl from a boring town in southwest England. Living, as she says herself, living in a small town in a small corner of southwest England has its faults, admittedly, but it does give me a chance to really think about things. It's a bit of a philosophy thing to say that, isn't it? So much happens so quickly, it seems, unless the media deliberately want to make a point, so it's hard to pick up on things that are worth something in the long term. I was advised to read The Invisibles by Dave, who runs the only comic shop within a half-hour drive. I could plot that, so she lives in this village in Wiltshire, which is named, and within a half-hour radius of that, that's not going to be many comic shops. So we could identify Dave if we wanted to, but who cares? I was advised to read The Invisibles by Dave, who runs the only comic shop within a half-hour drive. I really enjoyed the first issue. Okay, so I did used to think comics were about superheroes and fighting. The Invisibles has really opened my eyes. The Invisibles is kind of about superheroes and fighting. I want to make that clear. I don't know why people want to criticise it anyway. Maybe I'm just not blind to creativity, ... yet. Issues 1 to 8 are absorbing and brilliant from someone who knows very little about comics but appreciates anything with an ounce of inspiration. She's a little bit precocious and self-regarding, as you can tell. A little bit. Living in a small town in England, living in a small town in a small corner of southwest England has its faults, admittedly, but it does give me a chance to really think about things. That's a slightly pompous thing to say. But there's a twist in the story. So I haven't heard it. So I'm like, wow, did she just drop off the radar? Did she kind of, move abroad? Did she change jobs? Did she stop writing? I haven't seen any more books from her in the 10-ish years since One Dimensional Woman came out and the student riots thing, which and I'm sure I'm sure being involved in the student movement around then was hard going. Right, like that. Those kind of protest movements are difficult. They take a lot of energy. People get burnt out on them quite quickly, or they can do. But hey, you can just Google it, right? So I kind of tracked down Nina Power, and it was upsetting actually. And once I reflected on her letter being captured in black and white in this particular issue of The Invisibles, which is, as we've just discussed, this is an issue of The Invisibles, which is about, the small things that can turn a good man or an innocent child evil without them noticing, or bad without them noticing, right? It can make this aspirational, fresh-faced wannabe spaceman. It can make him into a hired thug, who beats his wife. Just these tiny incremental tragedies and these loops of violence that we get born into without really having much choice in the matter. In an issue that's about that, the fact that Nina Power's letter appears here was upsetting. Because, right, she's involved in this extremely online hullabaloo about so basically about earlier in 2019, she appeared on a YouTube video with these two guys. But there's this online anonymous sort of blog about this video that these three are in, Nina Power and these two other blokes. And it accuses them of a lot of bad stuff. And it's like, some of it, as I say, sounds a little bit of an over accusation, and a lot of it you're like, yeah, that's right. So where it seems to hinge basically is on like a second wave feminism understanding of gender, right? Which is another way of saying she doesn't think that trans people should have human rights, I guess. I'm not saying that that's what she thinks, but those philosophies are very that adjacent in my mind. They're gender critical, right? Which is a way of saying that my friends who are trans don't deserve human rights, and so I'm not down with that. I think that's bad. I think that's the bad guys in The Invisibles have those kind of thoughts. And she freely, and so there's more stuff of her on YouTube. She talks very well, if a bit like elliptically. And she's kind of into nature worship and and that isn't automatically fascist, right? Liking nature, but kind of like the urban left can over focus on that. She's and the three of them, the three, Nina Power and her two buddies, are very critical of wokeness, right? And they use terms like based, which is a total red flag. That's like 2016 frog avatar Trump asshole time, right? That's bad news when you hear people saying shit like that. It's a flag. And she's but they're extremely online. They're extremely online because they talk about the left as being this kind of bogeyman, but it's not like the left is kind of pushing at the borders of, the left is arguably in the ascendant in the UK and in the US. The left is kind of stronger than it has been for a very long time in the UK and in the USA. And yet these three whinge about the left being too woke and cancelling people, and they call them like blue checks, right? Which is the annoying like New York Times, like Clintonite assholes who aren't left by any reasonable estimation at all, and who and who write their centrist drivel on the internet and dogpile on people, cancel people. Yeah, you know what cancelling is. And the whole thing's really nasty, actually. And Nina Power's got some. She freely admits in some of her other videos that she's suffering. Not suffering. She's coming out of a 2-year serious kind of alcoholism problem, which is easy to believe. Alcoholism tends to go for the best bits of you first, right? It kills your empathy, or rather, kind of repoints your empathy at you, manifesting in this kind of self-pity, and it's not a terribly edifying sight, and it can lead to some really dark places. All of this, like they've got a big hard-on for like Julius Evola and Nick Land and Mencius Moldbug and all of those assholes who are just kind of trying to use technology to reinvent like absolute monarchy. It's a horrible philosophy. Julius Evola's an interesting one. He's like the Aleister Crowley of Italo-fascism, right? He's this leading light of like occult far right philosophy, who's been very influential on the continent, especially in Italy. He's funny because he was such a dick such an idiot that and this is quite interesting because this is something which used to be quite widely known about Julius Evola, and now it's not on his Wikipedia page, and it's like, and you can't find it. Basically, it's funny. He was alive during the Second World War. He was in Hamburg during the Second World War because obviously he was. It looks like he was doing outsourced malefica, like attack magic, for the Germans after most of the German ones had already been sort of taken off the board through like internal purges, like and Hitler going increasingly crazy, and the kind of internal Nazi power politics pushing a lot of the esoterically minded ones out. Yet they probably still would have had a couple of black magicians on the payroll, and so they would have outsourced it, I think, to someone like Julius Evola. So he was in Hamburg doing intelligence, espionage, magic work, right? He used to go out walking around in during airstrikes, right? During bombardments, because he was like a kind of a Sturm and Drang style fascist asshole, and like just loved the noise and the explosions and the fire and the power. He loved that. So he literally used to, when everybody else was hiding in the Anderson shelter, like Bobby Murray's mum Ina would have been, right? Instead of hiding in the shelter, he would walk around the city delighting in the chaos and not the chaos, but the destruction all around him. And obviously he got his dick blown off by a bomb. And he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, coming up with these bitter, bizarre fascist philosophies, screaming at the world about how he couldn't fucking use his dick anymore because he was stupid enough to go walking during an air raid. And it's like, okay, and loads of people in America and in Italy, on the continent and the UK, on the right, on the far right, on the fascist right, think that Julius Evola is great when obviously he's a fucking idiot. And his philosophy is basically the philosophy of a man who's enraged at the world for having blown his dick off, and I think that's funny. And Nina Power and her buddies are kind of looking at these philosophies. I think there's an interesting sort of overlap between Julius Evola and, say, Nick Land, because I think that Julius Evola is one of the first people to actually use to talk about accelerationism, and he uses it because he was a traditionalist. Traditionalism is basically just a postmodern assemblage of spurious interpretations of history that seek to justify continued white supremacy. That's what traditionalism is, with a capital T. That was Julius Evola's philosophy, and he comes up with all kinds of bullshit to justify what he wants to do, which is basically just make sure that Western imperial powers and toxic male violence like he likes become the deciding, become like win at history. But it's kind of its pick and mix approach to history is so like decadent postmodernism that it hurts. Like the whole philosophy is this terrible bundle of idiocies, contradictions, and there's her letter in The Invisibles, and she's been swallowed up by the outer church, maybe. I don't think I finished my thought earlier. I don't think Julius Evola and accelerationism go together, and yet the neo-reactionary NRX, that lot, have spliced them together in a way which is fairly, intellectually wild and interesting for that. But I don't think it's quite right. Don't think that's it, guys. I don't think you're there. Anyway, so that's really sad and not insignificant. There's another one here from James Liu at the Department of Psychology in Wellington, New Zealand. He writes a nice long letter about comics and sci-fi and academia, and that's it. There's another kind of a funny letter from written by two people, from Charles Blackledge and Robert Griffith. Dear Grant, we have a bet going. Which influences your work more, the crack or the heroin? P.S. Is it true what they say about Peter Milligan? It has to, and Morrison's answer is, it has to be the crack, all the way from ceiling to floor. P.S. Generally, yes. So what they say about Peter Milligan is generally true. Another letter by Narissa Newman, who cleverly, sensibly withholds her address, and has a go at Grant Morrison for getting the I Ching hexagram wrong in issue 8, was it 9? 9. Remember, we talked about that at the time. And he's like, yeah, sorry, I got it wrong. Or someone got it wrong. Then there's a letter from a guy called Anthony Gallagher, who lives in Camden Town in 1995. I mean, Anthony Gallagher, his surname is Gallagher. He's having his best life. He's doing great. And he talks about Ken Kesey and the electric Kool-Aid acid test, and Ken Kesey's influenced by superheroes. It's a good letter. It's a really good letter. Terence McKenna, DMT, John the Baptist, Oasis or Portishead. It's basically, this letter is a bit like me banging on for ages about in an invisible podcast, right? And Morrison gives him a good answer too. Oasis, they're the Ruttles for the 90s, aren't they? Which is fine by me, Grant. Oasis has got about 4 really good songs. So have the Ruttles. Actually, time has taken that line of Morrison's quite well. And that's it. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the letters this week because I spent too long talking about the other one. Come back to the light, Nina Powell. Remember your invisibles, mate. Come on, come back. Be a goodie again. Okay, so all right. Okay, then we're on to the next issue bar. King, and this is Morrison voice, obviously. King Mob and the gang, remember them? Are back, beginning a search for the missing Jack Frost, which will take them to the limits of sanity and reality. All this and the secret origin of Lord Fanny 2 as we zip ourselves into our most dazzling frocks and descend into the shimmering transvestite demimonde of She-Man. Yeah, I think that's going to be a weird one, guys. We'll get to that next month. On the Ledge column is written by Ed Brubaker, who would go on to become a very celebrated noir comics writer, and I think he does loads of superhero stuff. I'm sure he's written a few TV shows by now. He's writing about his comic that he's got coming out from Vertigo this month in 1995. It's like Prez. Prez is like a fun sort of 60s comic idea of like what if a teenager became the president of the USA? How hilarious and what kind of cool stuff would he do? And this Prez comic from 1995 is Ed Brubaker rewriting that for the post-Cobain era, and it is one of the worst comics I've ever read. Like it's exactly as bad as Prez rewritten for the post-Cobain era sounds. It's every bit of rubbish that you can imagine from that description. It's that, and he writes this fairly tedious on the Ledge column about it, which actually has a bit of a. It has a fairly it actually opens. Grant Morrison wrote in an Invisibles letter page about the virtues of being a poseur. Well, unlike Grant, I hate poseurs. So he's throwing fairly uncomplicated shade at Morrison there, and kind of shits his pants because this Prez comic that he's using that as a launch pad to write about is rubbish. Is really rubbish. And a lot of it, and I've enjoyed plenty of Ed Brubaker comics in my life. I'm not going to say that he's rubbish. Other stuff that's coming out from Vertigo this month: Sandman Midnight Theatre. That's the Golden Age Sandman and the Gaiman Age Sandman having a team up by Neil Gaiman, Matt Wagner, and Teddy Christensen. I've never read that. I bet it's good. Prez. That's not very good. Enigma coming out as a trade paperback. We discussed that at the start with the young man with the invisible lizards on him. It's a very good comic, guys. Next month coming up, there's Millennium Fever #1 by Nick Abadzis and Duncan Fegredo. I don't think I've read that, but I bet it's great. Vertigo Gallery, Dreams and Nightmares. Oh, and a DC book of note. Obviously, Vertigo doesn't often advertise DC comics, even though they're all the same company really, because Vertigo's got its own sort of special readership. A DC book of note, Man Bat, #1 of 3. When a mutated genetic engineer's demented dreams of genocide become close to reality, the Batman, not Batman, the Batman, must navigate a moral minefield to save humanity from becoming a deadly species of man-bats. It sounds so good! Save humanity from becoming a deadly species of man-bats. Why are you doing, Batman? Don't save us from that. This is a lean-in moment, mate. This Batman Prestige Elseworlds miniseries is written by Jamie Delano with evocative painted artwork by John Bolton. I've never read that. And I want to so much. It sounds absolutely brilliant. I've seen it around and was always a bit like, it doesn't look like there's enough fighting in it. But, and John Bolton's artwork is a bit much, But that now, it just sounds exactly how I want to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Do you know what I mean? I just want to read that. So yeah, Man Bat, #1 of 3. I'm going to try and find it. That's my next little find a weird old 90s comic mission. And then on to the back page, which is the page that the viewers have been, the viewers, have been able to see most of, probably, while I've been holding the comic throughout the course of this rather long video. I do apologise, guys. I don't apologise. This is the best page in the comic, maybe, in this very good comic. Look at it. It's an advert for all of the Judge Dredd Stallone movie spin-off toys with a picture of every toy. It's freaking brilliant. So we've got these weird little Judge Dredd action figures with his crap kind of movie version bike. You've got Hammerstein from the ABC Warriors, sans hammer, unfortunately, but it is, it's him. Got these, some of these kind of mutants and stuff, like Fergie, even though it's like, Fergie, even though that's not what Fergie looks like at all, and the movie version of Fergie is rubbish. Judge Death, who's not even in the film, but they're like, wow, we've got to make a Judge Death toy if we're making Judge Dredd toys, because he's Judge Dredd's, arch nemesis, even though he's not in the film. And that Judge Death toy look how big his hands are. It just looks brilliant. I want it so much. I've never seen. I mean, like, these were obviously not licensed to be sold in the UK. I have never seen one of these in the flesh, ever. And I want to. I want that Judge Death. I want that Judge Death. I know I've got some mates who want that Judge Death, even like who would. I can imagine them doing terrible, terrible acts to get that Judge Death action figure. I'd go fairly far, but some of the lads I know, and you know who you are. I know you're not watching this, but you know who you are. You'd go nuts for that, wouldn't you? Yeah, brilliant. An absolutely cracking humdinger of an advert to finish off the comic with. Remember, I had a thing the other time about how Judge Dredd's world is kind of the result that the baddies in the Invisibles want us to have, minus the jokes. So Judge Dredd is intrinsically relevant to the Invisibles. Grant Morrison never wrote Judge Dredd. He did write Judge Dredd, but he did it so badly that I say he never wrote Judge Dredd. Yeah, look at these action figures. Look at that Judge Dredd. Look at that Judge Death. That's it. Thanks for watching. If you dare. That's it. That's the end of the show. It's the end of the comic. Back next time. Might try something different next time. Might not. Depends how organised I am. But thanks for watching. That was the Invisible Podcast. Check me out on Twitter at bobsy mindless to have a go at me or whatever, or tell me what I missed or where I got wrong in this epic exegesis of this rather excellent little comic. And and I'll see you next month. I'll see you next time. Okay, cheers guys. Keep subscribing to the Diane Patreon. It's only $1 to get all this content, all of this bloke reading the Invisibles content. It's great. Thanks for watching. Lots of love. Bye.